the birth of everything. Before time had meaning, before space held form, before light knew darkness, there existed only chaos. Not the frenzied disorder we imagine today, but something far more profound. A vast, primordial void that contained within itself the seeds of all possibility. This was the womb of creation, pregnant with potential yet utterly formless, a cosmic silence that held the breath of eternity. In the depths of this endless emptiness, something stirred. Not movement as we understand it, for there was no space in which to move, but rather a fundamental shift in the very nature of existence. The Greeks called this moment the awakening of consciousness within chaos itself, the first spark of divine awareness that would forever change the fabric of reality. From this stirring came Gaia, the Earth Mother, emerging not as a planet, but as the very concept of substance and form. She was matter-given consciousness, the first solid foundation upon which all future creation would rest. Her birth was not gentle. It was a violent tearing of the void, a cosmic scream that shattered the perfect silence and introduced the first duality, being and non-being. Simultaneously, from the same primordial depths rose Erebus, the personification of darkness, and Nyx, the goddess of night. These were not merely shadows or absence of light, for light itself did not yet exist. They were the active principles of the unknown, the conscious darkness that would define all boundaries between the seen and unseen, the known and unknowable. The union of Erebus and Nyx produced the first children of creation ever, the bright upper air, and Hemera, the day. With their birth, the fundamental rhythm of existence began, the eternal dance between light and shadow, consciousness and rest, activity and repose. This was not merely the creation of day and night, but the establishment of time itself as a cosmic principle. Yet Gaia, in her solitude upon the newly formed foundation of reality, felt the stirring of creative force within herself. Without partner or consummation, she gave birth to Uranus, the star-filled heavens, creating above herself a cosmic dome that would become both her companion and her domain. This act of self-generation established the first divine precedent. The gods would create according to their will alone, bound by no laws save those of their own nature. The marriage of earth and sky produced the first dynasty of divine beings, the 12 Titans, beings of immense power who embodied the fundamental forces of the cosmos. Cronus ruled time, Rhea governed the flow of generations. Oceanus commanded the world river that encircled all lands, and Hyperion blazed as the first light-bringer. These were not merely powerful beings, they were living embodiments of cosmic law. But even in this early paradise, the seeds of violence had already been sown. Uranus, fearing the power of his children, began to push them back into Gaia's womb immediately upon their birth, refusing to let them see the light of his starry realm. Each suppressed child caused Gaia immense pain, and with each act of suppression, divine resentment grew like a cancer in the heart of creation. The youngest of the Titans, Cronus, possessed a cunning that matched his father's cruelty. When Gaia could no longer bear the imprisonment of her children, she forged from her own substance a great sickle of adamant, and whispered to Cronus the terrible deed that would free his siblings. This moment marks the first divine conspiracy, the establishment of a pattern that would repeat through every generation of gods. When Uranus descended to embrace Gaia, as was his nightly custom, Cronus struck with the divine blade, severing his father's manhood and casting it into the sea. The blood that fell upon the earth gave birth to the Furies, the three goddesses of vengeance whose purpose would be to pursue those who shed kindred blood. The drops that fell into the ocean created Aphrodite, goddess of love, born from violence yet destined to inspire the gentler passions. With Uranus castrated and powerless, the Titans emerged into the light of creation for the first time. But Cronus had learned from his father's example, and when he took the throne of heaven, he did not forget the prophecy that one of his own children would someday overthrow him. The cycle of divine violence had been established, and each generation would repeat the sins of the one before. Cronus married his sister Rhea, and their union produced the gods who would become the Olympians: Hestia, goddess of the hearth; Demeter, who would command the harvest; Hera, destined for queenly power; Hades, lord of the unseen realm; Poseidon, who would rule the seas; and finally Zeus, whose destiny it was to complete the pattern begun by his grandfather's fall. But Cronus, remembering his father's fate, devoured each child immediately upon birth. The taste of divine flesh drove him to madness, and with each swallowed god, his paranoia grew. Rhea watched in horror as her children disappeared into her husband's maw, and like Gaia before her, she began to plan her revenge. When Zeus was born, Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and presented it to Cronus, hiding her true son in a cave on Crete where the Curetes, young gods of wild nature, drowned out his cries with their frenzied dancing and clashing of spears. There, nursed by the goat Amalthea and fed on honey and nectar, the future king of gods grew to maturity in secret. The island of Crete became Zeus's first kingdom, a hidden realm where he learned the arts of war and rulership from the wisest of the ancient powers. The nymph Metis, whose name means wisdom, became his teacher and later his first wife. It was she who provided the emetic that would force Cronus to vomit up his swallowed children, still alive within their father's belly. When Zeus returned to challenge his father, the cosmic order trembled. The war that followed, known as the Titanomachy, raged for 10 years and shook the very foundations of reality. Mountains were hurled like spears, seas boiled and dried, and the sky itself cracked under the strain of divine battle. This was not merely a struggle for power. It was a fundamental reshaping of the cosmic order. Zeus freed not only his siblings, but also the Cyclops and the hundred-handed ones, the children of Gaia whom Uranus had imprisoned even before the Titans were born. These primordial beings, grateful for their liberation, forged for Zeus the thunderbolt, for Poseidon the trident, and for Hades the helmet of invisibility, weapons that would become the symbols of their power. The Cyclops, masters of fire and forge, embodied the raw creative power of the cosmos itself. Their single eyes saw not just the surface of things, but their essential nature, their divine purpose. In crafting Zeus's thunderbolt, they were not merely making a weapon. They were creating a tool through which the will of the cosmos could express itself directly. The hundred-handed ones, called hecatoncheires, were violence personified, but violence in service of cosmic justice. Each possessed 50 heads and 100 arms, And when they joined the battle against the Titans, they hurled entire mountain ranges like stones, reshaping the geography of the divine realm with every throw. As the war reached its climax, Zeus freed the most terrible of Gaia's children, Typhon, the dragon of chaos, thinking to use this monster against the Titans. But Typhon, born from the earth's rage at the imprisonment of her children, recognized no master. His 100 snake heads breathed every kind of destruction, and his eyes blazed with the fire of stars gone mad. The battle between Zeus and Typhon threatened to undo creation itself. When Typhon's coils wrapped around the young god, it seemed that chaos would reclaim the cosmos. But Zeus, wielding the thunderbolt forged by the Cyclops, struck again and again until Typhon's strength failed. The defeated dragon was buried beneath Mount Etna, where his fiery breath still occasionally breaks forth as volcanic eruption. With Typhon defeated and the Titans bound in Tartarus, Zeus established the new order of the cosmos. But the victory came at a price that would echo through all future ages. The Furies, born from Uranus's blood, still wandered the earth seeking those who shed kindred blood. The cycle of violence had not been broken. It had simply been passed to a new generation. Zeus divided the cosmos among his brothers. He kept the sky and its thunder. Poseidon claimed the seas and all their depths, and Hades accepted dominion over the realm of the dead. The earth they agreed to share, though each would claim supremacy when it suited their purposes. This division seemed just, but it contained the seeds of future conflict. The establishment of Olympus as the seat of divine power marked a new age in cosmic history. The 12 great gods took their thrones in the celestial palace, each ruling over their own domain, yet all subject to Zeus's supreme authority. But the memory of how Zeus had gained his throne haunted every divine relationship. Hera, Zeus's sister and queen, never forgot that her husband's power rested on the same violence that had destroyed his predecessors. Her jealousy was not merely personal. It was a divine principle, the cosmic force that ensures no power remains unchallenged forever. Every one of Zeus's affairs was an opportunity for her to demonstrate that even the king of gods could not escape the consequences of his desires. The marriage of Zeus and Hera became a cosmic drama played out across the heavens, their conflicts manifesting as storms and natural disasters on Earth. When Zeus pursued other goddesses or mortal women, Hera's revenge fell not only upon her rivals, but upon their children, establishing the pattern of divine justice that punishes the innocent along with the guilty. From Zeus's many unions came the second generation of Olympian gods, Apollo and Artemis, the divine twins of sun and moon, Athena born fully grown from Zeus's own head, Dionysus torn from his dying mother's womb and sewn into his father's thigh, Ars, the god of war born from Zeus, and Hera's tempestuous union, Aphrodite already present from the castration of Uranus, and Hephaestus the divine smith whose lameness reflected the imperfection inherent in all created things. Each of these younger gods carried within themselves the contradictions of their divine heritage. Apollo, god of light and reason, was also the bringer of plague. Artemis, protector of young animals, was also the huntress who delighted in their death. Athena, goddess of wisdom, was born through violence and remained forever a warrior. These paradoxes were not flaws but essential aspects of divine nature. The birth of Athena deserves special attention, for it reveals the fundamental nature of divine consciousness. When Zeus swallowed Metis to prevent her from bearing a son who might overthrow him, he absorbed not just his wife, but the very principle of wisdom itself. Athena's birth from his head represented the integration of wisdom with power, but it also demonstrated that even wisdom could become a tool of tyranny. Dionysus's birth was equally significant, for it showed that life could emerge from death itself. When Hera's jealousy caused his mortal mother Semele to be destroyed by Zeus's lightning, the unborn god was saved by being sewn into his father's thigh. His second birth from Zeus's body made him twice born, a god who understood both mortality and divinity, both ecstasy and suffering. The younger gods, born into a world where divine violence was already established as cosmic law, adapted to this reality in their own ways. Some, like Apollo, sought to impose order through art and prophecy. Others, like Dionysus, embraced chaos as a path to transcendence. But all carried within themselves the fundamental contradiction of divine power, the need to destroy in order to create. As the Olympian order stabilized, patterns emerged that would govern all future divine activity. The gods formed alliances and enmities based not on abstract principles, but on the complex web of family relationships created by the cycle of divine violence. Zeus's position as father and king made him the center of these relationships, but it also made him the primary target of divine ambition. The creation of humanity itself emerged from this divine dysfunction. When Prometheus stole fire from the gods to give to mortals, he was not simply helping primitive beings discover technology. He was introducing into the world the very principle that had driven divine evolution, the willingness to rebel against established authority for the sake of a higher purpose. Zeus's punishment of Prometheus, chaining him to a rock where an eagle would eat his liver daily, only for it to regenerate each night, established the divine precedent for eternal torment. This was not mere cruelty, but cosmic justice. The punishment must match the crime not in duration, but in its fundamental nature. Prometheus had sought to change the cosmic order, so he would experience unchanging suffering. The gods' relationship with humanity reflected their own internal conflicts. They demanded worship and sacrifice, yet they envied mortal ability to change and grow. They punished human pride while secretly admiring human creativity. They granted divine gifts while ensuring that those gifts came with prices that often exceeded their value. The story of Pandora illustrates this divine ambivalence perfectly. Created as punishment for Prometheus's theft, she was given gifts by all the gods: beauty from Aphrodite, skill from Athena, cunning from Hermes, and curiosity that would prove to be humanity's blessing and curse. When she opened the jar that released all evils into the world, she also ensured that hope would remain as humanity's companion through all suffering. In the Norse tradition, this same pattern played out with different characters but identical themes. Odin, the All-Father, gained his wisdom through self-sacrifice, hanging himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights, with his own spear piercing his side. This was not masochism, but recognition that true power requires the willingness to sacrifice everything, even oneself. The birth of Loki as Odin's blood brother established the principle that chaos and order must be bound together for the cosmos to function. Loki was not evil in any simple sense. He was the necessary principle of change that prevented the divine order from becoming static and lifeless. His tricks and betrayals served the same cosmic function as Zeus's overthrow of the Titans. The Norse understanding of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, revealed the ultimate truth that the Greek myths only hinted at. All divine orders are temporary. The cycle of violence that began with Uranus would eventually consume even the gods themselves. This was not tragedy, but cosmic necessity. The universe could only renew itself through the destruction of what came before. In Egyptian mythology, this principle manifested in the eternal struggle between Ra and Apophis. Order and chaos locked in daily combat as the sun goddess boat traveled through the underworld each night. The victory of order was never permanent. It had to be won anew each day, just as the sun had to be reborn each morning from the darkness that had temporarily conquered it. The birth of Set's jealousy toward his brother Osiris followed the same pattern established in Greek myth. The murder and dismemberment of Osiris was both historical event and cosmic principle. The necessary death that makes resurrection possible, Isis's gathering and restoration of her husband's scattered pieces, became the model for all future acts of divine healing and renewal. These patterns, established in the first moments of divine consciousness, continue to govern the relationship between order and chaos, creation and destruction, power and responsibility. The gods did not choose violence. They discovered that consciousness itself requires the constant tension between opposing forces to maintain its vitality and growth. The cycle continues because it must. Each generation of gods believes it has learned from the mistakes of its predecessors. Yet each repeats the fundamental pattern, the seizure of power. Through violence, the attempt to prevent change through control, and the inevitable rebellion that begins the cycle anew. This is not failure, but the very mechanism by which consciousness evolves and reality expands. From chaos came order, from order came conflict, from conflict came growth, and from growth comes the eternal dance of creation and destruction. That defines not just divine existence, but the very nature of reality itself. The birth of everything was also the birth of the eternal struggle that ensures everything will continue to be born anew, world without end. The Titans rise and fall in the aftermath of Uranus's castration, as his blood still stained the primordial earth and his severed flesh gave birth to the Furies. The cosmos held its breath. The first act of divine patricide had shattered the natural order, and from this wound in reality emerged a new kind of divine consciousness, one forever marked by the knowledge that power could be taken, that fathers could fall, and that sons inevitably rose to claim their inheritance through violence. Cronus, still gripping the adamantine sickle that had unmanned his father, felt the weight of his deeds settle into his bones like lead. The weapon that had freed him and his siblings from their earthen prison now seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life, whispering promises of future betrayals. As he gazed upon the blade's keen edge, still wet with divine ichor, he saw reflected there not just his triumph, but his inevitable doom. The 12 Titans emerged from Gaia's depths like gods of a new dawn, their forms magnificent beyond mortal comprehension. Oceanus rose as a living river that encircled all lands, his beard flowing with the waters of eternity. Thetis, his sister wife, embodied the fertile power of the sea itself, her womb containing all the rivers and springs that would nourish the world. Hyperion blazed with the first true light, while Thea, his consort, became the divine force that made gold and silver precious to mortal eyes. Quis represented the northern axis of heaven, the cosmic pillar around which all celestial motion revolved, while Phoebe glowed with the silver radiance of moon and prophecy. Crius commanded the southern reaches of the sky, and Themis embodied divine law itself. Not the arbitrary commands of rulers, but the fundamental principles that governed right and wrong, justice and injustice, the sacred bonds that held creation together. Mnemosyne became memory incarnate, the divine force that ensured nothing truly important could ever be forgotten. Her consciousness contained within itself every moment that had ever been, every word that had ever been spoken, every deed that had ever been performed. Through her, the gods would never escape the consequences of their actions, for she made certain that all debts would eventually come due. Iapetus, the titan of mortality and human craft, understood from the beginning that the age of pure divine rule was temporary. His sons would be Prometheus, Atlas, Epimetheus, and Menetius, names that would echo through eternity as symbols of foresight and consequence, burden and punishment. Even in his moment of liberation, Iapetus saw the threads of fate weaving toward a future where gods and mortals would share the world in ways none could yet imagine. But it was Rhea, the youngest of the Titanesses, who would bear the greatest burden of all. As the divine force governing the flow of generations, she understood better than any other that the cycle of violence, initiated by her brother Cronus' deed against their father, had created a cosmic law from which there could be no escape. Each generation would rise by destroying the one before, and each victory would contain within itself the seeds of future defeat. Cronus ascended to the throne of heaven with the weight of prophecy already settling around his shoulders like a funeral shroud. Gaia, the Earth Mother who had orchestrated his father's downfall, spoke to him with the voice of cosmic truth. As you have overthrown your father, so shall you be overthrown by your own son. The throne of heaven demands this price from all who would claim it. These words burned themselves into Cronus's divine consciousness. With the permanence of stellar fire, unlike his father Uranus, who had acted from simple jealousy and fear of his children's power, Cronus possessed something far more dangerous: perfect knowledge of his fate. He knew with absolute certainty that one of his children would destroy him, just as he had destroyed his father. This knowledge became the poison that would transform the greatest of the Titans into the most terrible of tyrants. At first, Cronus ruled with wisdom and justice. The age of the Titans became known to future generations as the Golden Age, when the earth produced its bounty without need for human labor, when lions lay down with lambs, when death itself was merely a gentle sleep from which mortals awakened in fields of eternal spring. Under Cronus's rule, time flowed differently, not as the relentless march toward decay and death that mortals would later know, but as a perfect circle where each moment contained all moments, where endings were also beginnings. Yet even in this paradise, the shadow of prophecy darkened Cronus's thoughts. He began to see in every sunrise a day closer to his downfall, in every celebration of his power a mocking reminder of its temporary nature. The other titans basking in the golden prosperity of their rule failed to notice their king's growing obsession with the future, his increasing tendency to stare into the depths of time itself, as if trying to spot the approaching footsteps of his destroyer. When Rhea announced that she carried their first child, Cronus felt the coils of fate tighten around his heart. As he placed his hand upon his sister wife's swelling belly, he could feel the life growing within. Not just a child, but a potential usurper, a future enemy, a living embodiment of the prophecy that haunted his every waking moment. The knowledge that he carried within his own bloodline the instrument of his destruction drove him to the edge of madness. Hestia, the first child of Cronus and Rhea, was born as the living embodiment of the hearth-fire that would one day warm mortal homes and make civilization possible. She emerged from her mother's womb radiating the gentle warmth of domestic peace, her infant cries harmonizing with the crackling of eternal flames. But when Cronus looked upon his daughter, he saw not innocence but threat, not love but doom. The moment Hestia drew her first breath, Cronus seized her in his massive hands and opened his divine maw. The taste of his own daughter's flesh as she disappeared into his throat was like swallowing liquid fire mixed with bitter ashes. Rhea's screams shattered the golden peace of the age as she watched her firstborn vanish into her husband's belly, still alive but forever imprisoned in the darkness of paternal fear. Demeter, the second child, emerged as the goddess who would make grain grow and harvests ripen, her birth accompanied by the spontaneous flowering of every plant on earth. But she too disappeared into Cronus's consuming darkness before she could take a second breath. The earth itself mourned her loss, and for the first time since the Golden Age began, winter touched the world, not as a season, but as a cosmic sob of grief. Hera, destined to become the Queen of Heaven and the embodiment of divine marriage, was swallowed before her divine radiance could fully manifest. Hades, who would rule the realm of the dead and serve as judge of mortal souls, vanished into his father's gullet while still covered in the sacred waters of birth. Poseidon, the future lord of earthquakes and ocean storms, disappeared with a sound like breaking waves and grinding stone. With each child devoured, Cronus felt the prophecy's grip loosen slightly, but the taste of their divine flesh drove him deeper into paranoid madness. He began to see potential enemies everywhere, in the other titans' expressions of concern, in Rhea's growing coldness toward him, in the very air that carried whispers of rebellion. The Golden Age continued for mortals, but for the royal family of heaven, it had become an era of horror beyond description. Rhea, watching her husband transform from wise king to monstrous cannibal, felt her own divine nature begin to change. The flowing power that governed generations and the passage of time became sharp and angular, twisted by grief into something approaching the fury that had driven Gaia to arm her son against Uranus. She began to understand that the cycle of divine violence was not a flaw in the cosmic order, but its very foundation. When Zeus was conceived, Rhea felt something different about this pregnancy. The child moved within her womb with a purpose and power that surpassed even his devoured siblings. Lightning flickered around her belly when he stirred, and thunder rumbled in clear skies when he dreamed. She knew with the certainty of divine intuition that this child was the one. The prophecy had foretold the son who would overthrow Cronus and break the chain of paternal tyranny. As her time approached, Rhea retreated to the island of Crete, telling Cronus she needed solitude for the birth. On the slopes of Mount Dictyn, a cave hidden from divine sight. By the ancient magic of the earth itself, she gave birth to Zeus while the Curetes danced and clashed their weapons to mask the sound of his cries. The newborn god blazed with such power that the cave walls wept golden tears, and eagles circled overhead as if recognizing their future king. But Zeus was more than just another potential usurper. From his first breath, he embodied something that had been missing from divine consciousness since the original act of patricide: the possibility of justice without vengeance, of power exercised for something greater than self-preservation. Where Cronus had been driven by fear of the future, Zeus would be motivated by vision of what that future could become. Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes, using her divine power to make it cry and move like a living infant. When she presented this deception to Cronus, he seized it without hesitation and swallowed it whole, so consumed by his paranoia that he never noticed he was devouring mere rock. The sound of stone grinding against his divine teeth should have alerted him to the trick, but fear had made him deaf to everything except the voice of prophecy in his head. Zeus grew to maturity in the hidden cave nursed by the goat Amalthea, whose milk contained the very essence of divine strength. Fed on honey that carried the wisdom of the earth's secret places, protected by spirits, who understood that they were raising not just a god, but the hope of cosmic renewal. The Curetes taught him the arts of war and strategy, while the nymphs of Crete showed him the deeper mysteries of natural law and the sacred bonds between ruler and subject. Unlike his father and grandfather before him, Zeus learned to see power not as something to be hoarded, but as something to be shared and exercised responsibly. The difference was crucial. Where Uranus and Cronus had ruled through fear and suppression, Zeus would rule through inspiration and justice. This was not because he was inherently more virtuous, but because his exile and hidden childhood had taught him lessons about power that could only be learned through powerlessness. When Zeus finally emerged from his Cretan sanctuary, he was not just another divine usurper seeking to repeat the old pattern of violent succession. He was something new in the cosmos, a god who understood that true strength came not from the ability to destroy one's enemies, but from the wisdom to transform them into allies. His first act was not to challenge Cronus directly, but to seek out the nymph Metis, whose name meant wisdom, and who would teach him the deeper strategies of cosmic transformation. Metis provided Zeus with the emetic that would force Cronus to vomit up his devoured children, but she also gave him something far more valuable: the understanding that the cycle of violence could only be broken by one who had learned to see beyond the immediate demands of power to the longer patterns of cosmic justice. Zeus's true weapon would not be the thunderbolt he had yet to receive, but the revolutionary idea that gods could rule through inspiration rather than terror. The confrontation between father and son, when it finally came, was not just a clash of individual wills, but a collision between two fundamentally different visions of divine authority. Cronus fought to preserve a world where power belonged to whoever could seize and hold it through force. Zeus fought to create a world where power would be exercised according to principles greater than personal ambition. When Zeus forced his father to disgorge the devoured siblings, they emerged not as the helpless infants they had been when swallowed, but as fully grown gods, their divine natures perfected by their time in their father's belly. Hestia rose as the perfect embodiment of peaceful domesticity, Demeter as the complete goddess of agricultural abundance, Hera as the full expression of royal dignity and marital fidelity. Hades emerged with the terrible wisdom that comes from dwelling in darkness, understanding death and judgment as no other god could. Poseidon arose with the wild power of storm and earthquake perfectly controlled, the raw forces of nature made responsive to divine will. Together, the 6 siblings represented a new kind of divine consciousness, one forged in suffering but tempered by hope. The war that followed, the Titanomachy, lasted 10 years because it was not merely a conflict between 2 generations of gods, but a fundamental restructuring of cosmic law. The older Titans fought to preserve the principle that might makes right, while the younger Olympians fought to establish the radical idea that right makes might. Victory would go not to the most ruthlessly powerful, but to those who could envision and create a better order. Zeus's crucial decision to free the Cyclops and hundred-handed ones from their imprisonment in Tartarus revealed his understanding that lasting victory required justice, not just strength. These ancient beings had been wronged by both Uranus and Cronus, and Zeus's first act as a war leader was to right those wrongs. In return, they provided him with the weapons that would make victory possible, the thunderbolt that made his will manifest as natural law itself, the defeat of Cronus, and the binding of the rebel titans in Tartarus marked the end of the age. When divine succession required patricide, Zeus did not kill his father, but imprisoned him, showing mercy even to the one who had sought to devour the future itself. This act of restraint, seemingly a weakness, was actually the beginning of a new kind of strength, the power to break cycles rather than perpetuate them. Yet even Zeus could not completely escape the patterns established by his predecessors. His own paranoia would lead him to swallow Metis when he learned she was pregnant with a child who might threaten his rule. The difference was that Athena's birth from his head showed that wisdom integrated with power could produce something greater than either alone. Not destruction of the father by the child, but synthesis of old and new into something unprecedented. The rise and fall of the Titans revealed the fundamental truth about divine consciousness. That power without wisdom inevitably consumes itself. But wisdom without power cannot protect what matters most. Zeus succeeded where his father and grandfather failed, not because he was more powerful, but because he learned to see power as a tool for creation rather than an end in itself. The cosmic order that emerged from the Titanomachy was not perfect. Zeus and his siblings would have their own conflicts, their own failures of wisdom and restraint. But it was an order based on the revolutionary principle that gods, like mortals, could learn from their mistakes and choose to become something better than what they had been. The horrific pattern of divine child devouring had been broken not through superior force, but through superior vision. In the end, Cronus's paranoia had been both his greatest weakness and the inadvertent architect of his own defeat. By trying to prevent the future, he had created the very conditions that made that future inevitable. Zeus succeeded because he chose to embrace the future rather than fear it, to see and change the possibility of growth rather than the certainty of destruction. The Titans' rise and fall thus became the foundational myth of divine evolution. The story of how consciousness learns to transcend its own limitations through the very struggles that seem most likely to destroy it. From chaos had come order, from order had come tyranny, and from tyranny had finally come justice. The pattern would continue, but never again in quite the same way. The Olympian Revolution, the first thunderbolt ever forged, blazed across the primordial sky like a declaration of war against the natural order itself. In the depths of Tartarus, the Cyclops hammered divine lightning into Zeus's hands, while the very foundations of reality trembled with anticipation. This was not merely another succession struggle between ambitious gods. This was revolution in its purest form, an attempt to remake the cosmos according to principles that had never before governed divine rule. The world that Zeus and his siblings sought to overthrow was not one of chaos or cruelty, but of stagnant perfection. Under Cronus's reign, the Golden Age had become a beautiful prison where mortals lived without effort or growth, where seasons never changed, where death was merely sleep and life held no real meaning. The Titans had created a world without struggle, without choice, without the very conflicts that make consciousness possible. But perfection, the younger gods had begun to understand, was itself a form of tyranny. In a world where nothing could fail, nothing could truly succeed. Where there was no death, there could be no heroism. Where there was no winter, spring held no promise. Where there was no darkness, light cast no shadows and revealed no mysteries. The Olympians fought not to destroy paradise, but to introduce into it the sacred principle of meaningful choice. Zeus stood before his liberated siblings in the hidden groves of Crete, his eyes blazing with visions of a cosmos that had never existed. He spoke of a world where gods would rule not through the simple exercise of overwhelming power, but through the complex dance of justice, mercy, wisdom, and strength. He envisioned a reality where divine authority would be earned through service, rather than simply claimed through conquest. Hestia, eldest of the siblings and first to emerge from their father's belly, radiated the quiet fire of domestic peace, but her flames now burned with revolutionary fervor. She understood that the hearth she would create would not be the static warmth of the Golden Age, but the active heat of homes where mortals would struggle and love and dream. Her fires would warm not just bodies, but ambitions. Not just food, but the cooking of plans for better futures. Demeter rose with the scent of growing grain clinging to her robes. But the harvest she envisioned was one that would require mortal labor, divine blessing, and the constant negotiation between human effort and natural bounty. She would teach mortals to work with the earth rather than simply receive its gifts, to understand that abundance earned through struggle tasted sweeter than plenty given without effort. Hera, destined to become the queen of the new order, blazed with a beauty that was both terrible and magnificent. She understood that the marriage she would embody would not be the simple union of complementary forces, but the complex dance of two independent wills choosing again and again to bind themselves together. Her domain would encompass not just weddings, but the daily choice to remain wed through all the challenges that real life would bring. Hades emerged from his imprisonment with the wisdom of one who had dwelt in absolute darkness and learned to see by inner light. His realm would not be the gentle sleep of the Golden Age's death, but a place of judgment and consequence where souls would face the true weight of their choices. He would create a world where actions had permanent meaning because they could lead to eternal reward or punishment. Poseidon arose with the wild song of untamed seas in his voice, his beard dripping with waters that had never known calm. The oceans he would rule would not be the peaceful streams of the Titan Age, but dangerous highways where mortals would risk everything in pursuit of adventure, knowledge, and connection with distant shores. His storms would be terrible, but they would also be the force that drove exploration and discovery. Together, the six siblings represented a revolutionary understanding of what divine rule could become. They would not simply command from their thrones, but would actively participate in the world they governed. They would not maintain cosmic order through suppression of change, but would guide change toward higher forms of justice and beauty. Most radically of all, they would share power not just among themselves, but with the mortals they would create. The decision to wage war against the Titans was not made in anger, but in sorrow. These younger gods understood that they were about to destroy the only paradise their world had ever known. The Golden Age was beautiful, peaceful, perfect in its way, and that perfection had become its own form of death. To create a world where growth was possible, they would have to introduce struggle, conflict, the very chaos that the Titans had spent eons learning to control. When Zeus stood before the assembled Titans and declared his intention to claim the throne of heaven, he was not simply announcing another coup. He was proclaiming a fundamental revision of the cosmic constitution. Divine right, he declared, would no longer flow from mere power, but from the ability to inspire and guide. Authority would be earned through wisdom, maintained through justice, and exercised in service to principles greater than personal ambition. Cronus, hearing these words from the son he had tried to devour, understood immediately that this was not a challenge he could meet with traditional weapons. Zeus was not simply trying to replace him. He was trying to replace the very concept of what it meant to be a ruler. The old king of time knew that his golden age, built on the suppression of change and growth, could not survive contact with gods who embraced change as a cosmic principle. The other Titans found themselves torn between loyalty to their traditional order and fascination with the radical vision their nephews and nieces proclaimed. Oceanus, the world river, saw in the Olympian plan the possibility of waters that would flow not in endless circles, but toward new destinations. Hyperion, the first light bringer, glimpsed the promise of illumination that would reveal not just surfaces, but hidden depths and distant possibilities. Yet many of the Titans could not accept a world where their hard-won stability would be sacrificed for the sake of mortal growth and divine experimentation. Themis, the embodiment of divine law, was torn between her recognition that the Olympian vision was just and her fear that abandoning the proven order of the Golden Age would lead to chaos and suffering. Atlas, who held up the heavens themselves, wondered what would happen to cosmic stability if the very foundations of divine authority were rebuilt. The war that followed was unlike anything the cosmos had ever witnessed. This was not merely a battle between two armies, but a conflict between two fundamentally different understandings of reality itself. Every weapon raised, every battle cry uttered, every alliance forged was simultaneously a physical act and a philosophical statement about the nature of existence. The Titans fought with the massive stability of eternal order. Their weapons were mountain ranges hurled like spears. Their armor was the accumulated wisdom of eons. Their strategy was based on the patient application of overwhelming force. They sought to end the rebellion by demonstrating that the old ways were simply too powerful, too well-established, too deeply rooted in cosmic law to be overthrown by upstart revolutionaries. The Olympians fought with the fluid adaptability of conscious choice. Zeus wielded thunderbolts that struck not just flesh, but the very concepts that held the Titan order together. Poseidon commanded earthquakes that shattered not just stone, but assumptions about what foundations could be trusted. Hades opened chasms that swallowed not just armies, but entire ways of thinking about life and death. The war's turning point came when Zeus made the crucial decision to free the Cyclops and hundred-handed ones from their imprisonment in Tartarus. This was not simply a tactical move to gain powerful allies. It was a demonstration of the Olympian principle that justice required the correction of past wrongs, even when those wrongs had been committed by one's enemies rather than one's friends. The Cyclops, masters of divine craft, who had been imprisoned simply for being too powerful and strange, represented all those who had been suppressed by the old order not for any crime, but for their potential to create change. When they emerged from Tartarus and began forging weapons for the revolution, they were not just making tools of war. They were creating the instruments through which a new kind of cosmic justice could manifest. The thunderbolt they crafted for Zeus was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of divine authority that derived its power not from tradition or inheritance, but from the marriage of wisdom and strength in service to justice. The trident they forged for Poseidon represented mastery over chaos that came not from suppression, but from understanding and guidance. The helmet of invisibility they created for Hades embodied the principle that true power sometimes required the wisdom to remain unseen and work through indirect influence. The hundred-handed ones, called hecaton chairs, were living embodiments of the overwhelming force that righteous anger could generate. When directed toward just ends, each possessed 50 heads that could see all perspectives simultaneously and 100 arms that could work toward multiple goals at once. Their release from Tartarus represented the Olympian understanding that effective revolution required not just opposition to the old order, but the ability to envision and work toward multiple aspects of the new order simultaneously. As the war raged across 10 years, reality itself began to reshape according to the principles for which each side fought. In regions controlled by the Titans, time flowed in the ancient patterns. Seasons maintained their perfect regularity, and mortals lived in the unchanging peace of the Golden Age. In territories claimed by the Olympians, New possibilities bloomed like flowers after wildfire, dangerous but alive with potential. The Olympians established their first capital not in some distant heaven, but on Mount Olympus, the highest peak in the mortal world. This choice was deeply symbolic. They would rule not from some realm, completely separate from the world they governed, but from a place that was both part of the earth and elevated above it. They would be accessible to their subjects while maintaining the perspective that distance and height could provide. From Olympus, Zeus began to articulate the constitution of the new order. Divine authority would be distributed among specialized domains rather than concentrated in a single ruler. Each god would have sovereignty within their sphere, but would be accountable to the others for how that sovereignty was exercised. Decisions affecting the whole cosmos would be made through council and debate, rather than by unilateral decree. Most revolutionary of all, the Olympians declared their intention to create mortals who would be neither slaves nor subjects, but partners in the great work of cosmic development. These beings would possess free will, the ability to choose between good and evil, wisdom and folly, creativity and destruction. They would be capable of surprising even the gods with their choices, and through their surprises, they would keep the divine realm itself growing and changing. The vision of humanity that emerged from Olympian planning sessions was breathtaking in its audacity. These mortals would be given divine fire, the spark of consciousness that would make them capable of art, science, philosophy, and love. They would be taught to work with the natural world rather than simply receiving its gifts. They would be encouraged to build civilizations, explore distant lands, create beauty, and seek truth. But the Olympians also understood that meaningful choice required meaningful consequences. The mortals they would create would be capable of genuine evil as well as authentic good. They would suffer and die, love and lose, triumph and fail. Their lives would be brief by divine standards, but intense with possibility. Through their struggles and achievements, they would provide the gods themselves with examples of courage, creativity, and growth. The Titan resistance gradually crumbled as more and more of the ancient powers began to see the beauty in the Olympian vision. Prometheus, son of Iapetus, became the first Titan to join the revolution, bringing with him the gift of foresight that would prove crucial in the final battles. His defection was particularly significant because it demonstrated that the war was not simply about young versus old, but about competing visions of what divine responsibility entailed. Prometheus understood that the Olympian plan to create free-willed mortals would require gods who were willing to accept limitation of their own power. In the Golden Age, divine will had been absolute and unquestioned. In the New Order, gods would have to earn mortal devotion through beneficence, maintain mortal loyalty through justice, and accept that mortals might sometimes choose to defy divine commands in service to higher principles. The final battle of the Titanomachy took place not on any earthly battlefield, but in the realm of pure concept, where the fundamental laws governing reality itself could be rewritten. Zeus faced Cronus in single combat that was simultaneously physical and philosophical, with each blow struck representing an argument about the nature of time, power, justice, and growth. Cronus fought with the terrible strength of one who knew that defeat meant not just personal destruction, but the end of an entire way of understanding existence. His weapons were the accumulated certainties of eons. His armor was the perfection of the Golden Age. His strategy was to demonstrate that the risks the Olympians proposed were too great to justify. Abandoning the security of proven order, Zeus fought with the fluid power of one who understood that growth required the courage to risk everything for the possibility of something better. His thunderbolts shattered not just his father's defenses, but the conceptual foundations upon which those defenses rested. Each strike was an argument for the value of choice over security, growth over stagnation, meaningful struggle over meaningless peace. When Cronus finally fell, it was not because Zeus was stronger, but because the old king of time could no longer sustain belief in his own vision. The Golden Age had been beautiful, but beauty without struggle was ultimately empty. Perfection without choice was ultimately meaningless. Order without growth was ultimately death. The binding of the defeated Titans in Tartarus was not an act of vengeance, but a recognition that the old order, while wrong for the future, had been necessary for its time. The Titans were not destroyed but preserved, their wisdom still accessible to the gods who would rule the new age. Atlas was given the task of holding up the heavens, not as punishment, but as recognition that even the new order would require some beings to maintain cosmic stability, while others experimented with change. The world that emerged from the Olympian victory was not the paradise that mortals would later imagine when they told stories of the gods. It was something far more challenging and far more meaningful. A cosmos where growth was possible, because failure was real where love mattered, because loss was genuine where heroism existed, because there were real battles to fight and real principles worth defending. The Olympians had fought to create a world where consciousness could evolve, where wisdom could be earned rather than simply inherited, where beauty could be created rather than merely preserved. They had sacrificed the perfect peace of the Golden Age for the imperfect vitality of an age, where gods and mortals together would write the ongoing story of cosmic development. Their revolution succeeded not because they were more powerful than the Titans, but because they were willing to embrace a more complex and demanding vision of what divine rule could become. They had fought not to preserve the past or control the future, but to create a present moment where choice, growth, and meaningful relationship between gods and mortals could flourish. The world they created would be marked by conflict, suffering, and uncertainty, but also by love, creativity, justice, and the endless possibility that conscious beings, both divine and mortal, could learn to become something greater than what they had been. This was the true victory of the Olympian Revolution, not the establishment of a new tyranny, but the creation of a cosmos where tyranny itself could be challenged and overcome through the marriage of wisdom, courage, and justice. The Age of Heroes begins. In the aftermath of the Titanomachy, as the smoke of divine war still drifted across the newly ordered cosmos, Zeus stood upon the heights of Olympus and gazed down at the world he had fought to transform. The earth lay empty and pristine, its mountains sharp-edged and clean, its rivers running clear without the touch of mortal hands, its forests untouched by the axes of civilization. It was beautiful in its emptiness, perfect in its silence, and utterly lifeless in any way that mattered. The victory over the Titans had been complete. But Zeus now faced a challenge that no amount of divine power could solve through force. How to populate this new world with beings capable of the growth and choice that had motivated the revolution itself. The cosmos needed consciousness to witness its beauty, intelligence to appreciate its complexity, and free will to participate in its ongoing creation. It needed mortals, but the creation of humanity would prove to be the most dangerous experiment the gods had ever attempted. Unlike the Titans, who embodied cosmic forces, or the Olympians themselves, who were consciousness made divine, mortals would possess something unprecedented, the ability to surprise even the gods. With their choices, they would be capable of rising to heights of heroism that inspired the divine realm itself, and of falling to depths of depravity that horrified even the most cynical deities. The first mortals emerged from the hands of Prometheus, the Titan who had joined the Olympian cause and whose name meant forethought. Working with clay from the sacred earth and water from the rivers of life, he shaped forms that resembled the gods themselves, but were limited by mortality, constrained by physical need, yet blessed with the spark of consciousness that made them more than mere animals. Prometheus understood that these beings would need more than just life. To fulfill their cosmic purpose, they would require the ability to transform their environment, to create beauty from raw materials, to forge tools that would extend their limited physical capabilities. Most crucially, they would need fire, not just the physical flame that could warm their bodies and cook their food, but the divine fire of consciousness itself that would allow them to think, dream, create, and aspire. The gift of fire was not just a practical necessity, but a theological revolution. Fire belonged to the gods, was the very substance of divine thought and creative power. To give fire to mortals was to make them, in a sense, junior partners in the divine work of cosmic development. It was to acknowledge that consciousness itself was too precious to be hoarded by the immortals alone. Zeus watched this first gift with growing unease. He had envisioned mortals as conscious beings, yes, but perhaps more like intelligent animals who would provide worship and admiration without posing any real challenge to divine authority. The fire that blazed in the first human hearths seemed to burn with possibilities that even his far-seeing mind could not fully predict or control. The early humans spread across the earth with a speed and adaptability that astonished even their creators. They built cities where none had existed, carved roads through wilderness, sailed across seas that had known only the passage of divine beings. They created art that captured beauty in forms the gods had never imagined, told stories that revealed truths about existence that surprised even Zeus himself. But with their creativity came qualities that disturbed the divine order. Humans proved capable of deception, cruelty, and violence on scales that shocked beings who had witnessed the titanomachy itself. They turned the fire Prometheus had given them not just toward beneficial creation, but toward destruction of each other and the natural world. They used their intelligence not just for worship and wonder, but for schemes and ambitions that threatened to upset the careful balance the Olympians were trying to establish. The Bronze Age that emerged from these first generations of humanity was marked by warriors whose strength approached the heroic, whose ambitions reached toward the divine, and whose capacity for both nobility and brutality exceeded anything the gods had anticipated. These humans built cities that rivaled Olympus in their splendor, forged weapons that could wound immortal flesh, and began to speak of themselves as equals to the gods who had created them. Zeus found himself facing a dilemma that struck at the heart of the Olympian revolution. The free will he had insisted mortals must possess was allowing them to choose paths that threatened the very cosmic order the war against the Titans had been fought to establish. Yet to suppress their freedom would be to betray the principles for which the revolution had been waged. The solution, when it came, would test the limits of divine wisdom and divine mercy. The breaking point arrived when the Bronze Age humans began to organize themselves into armies capable of threatening not just each other, but the gods themselves. Led by kings who claimed divine ancestry and warriors who refused to acknowledge any authority higher than their own strength, they began to plan assaults on Olympus itself. The fire Prometheus had given them had evolved into a blaze of ambition that threatened to consume the cosmic order. Lycaon, king of Arcadia and descendant of the first humans, embodied everything that had gone wrong with the mortal experiment. Beautiful, intelligent, and utterly without moral restraint, he ruled his kingdom through terror and practiced abominations that defiled the very earth on which they were performed. When Zeus came to test human hospitality in disguise, Lycaon attempted to serve him the flesh of a murdered child, believing that even the king of gods could be corrupted. Through the right combination of flattery and horror, the revelation of Lycaon's nature, his transformation into a wolf, forever hunting but never satisfied, became for Zeus a symbol of what unlimited human freedom could produce. Without divine guidance, without the restraints that came from acknowledging higher authority, mortals could become monsters that made the most terrible titans seem benevolent by comparison. Yet other humans of that age displayed virtues that amazed the gods. Deucalion, son of Prometheus, ruled his people with justice and wisdom that rivaled divine law itself. Pyrrha, his wife, embodied a compassion that moved even Hera to tears. They represented the possibility that mortals could choose to become something greater than their creators had dared to hope, partners worthy of the divine realm itself. The decision to flood the world came not from anger, but from a terrible necessity that Zeus recognized with the clarity of cosmic responsibility. The experiment in mortal free will had produced results beyond the ability of even divine wisdom to predict or control. Some humans had become heroes whose nobility inspired the gods themselves, while others had become abominations whose mere existence corrupted the fabric of reality. The flood that followed was not a simple act of destruction, but a cosmic surgery performed to save the patient of reality itself. Zeus did not act in rage but in sorrow, understanding that the mortal experiment had revealed both the greatest promise and the gravest danger inherent in consciousness itself. The waters that covered the earth washed away not just the corrupt Bronze Age civilization, but the knowledge that unlimited freedom could lead to unlimited corruption. Yet even as the waters rose, Zeus ensured the survival of those mortals who had proven worthy of the divine gift they had received. Deucalion and Pyrrha, guided by Prometheus's foresight, built an ark that carried not just their physical forms, but the spiritual essence of human potential at its finest. They would become the seeds of a new human age, one that would benefit from the lessons learned in the destruction of the first. The world that emerged from the receding floodwaters was different in subtle but crucial ways. The raw power that had marked the Bronze Age humans was diminished, but their capacity for growth and wisdom remained intact. They would have to earn through struggle and choice the heroic stature that their predecessors had claimed through mere strength. The age of easy power was over. The age of earned nobility was beginning. It was into this transformed world that Prometheus made his second great gift to humanity. Having seen the results of his first gift of fire, he understood that mortals would need not just power, but wisdom. Not just strength, but knowledge of how that strength should be used. The fire he stole from Olympus this time was not the raw flame of consciousness, but the refined fire of craft, art, and moral understanding. This second theft was far more dangerous than the first, for Zeus now knew exactly what mortal fire could accomplish. Yet Prometheus acted not in defiance of divine will, but in service to the deeper purpose that had motivated the Olympian revolution itself. He understood that consciousness without growth was meaningless, that safety without challenge was death, that order without the possibility of transcendence was just another form of tyranny. The fire Prometheus brought to the post-flood humans was carefully measured, precisely calibrated to provide them with the tools they would need to grow toward heroism, without giving them the raw power to threaten cosmic order through mere ambition. This was divine fire refined through wisdom, creative power tempered by moral understanding, the flame of consciousness made safe through the hard-won knowledge of its proper use. Zeus's response to this second theft revealed the complex evolution of divine wisdom. Through experience, the punishment he visited upon Prometheus, chaining him to a rock where an eagle would devour his liver each day for eternity, was terrible but not final. Unlike the permanent binding of the Titans in Tartarus, Prometheus's torment contained within itself the possibility of eventual redemption through the actions of a mortal hero. This distinction was crucial, for it acknowledged that Prometheus had acted not from rebellion, but from love, not from ambition, but from service to principles higher than personal safety. His punishment was real and terrible, but it was also temporary, awaiting the arrival of a hero great enough to free him. A hero who would demonstrate that mortals had finally learned to use their divine gifts in service to justice rather than mere power. The humans who received this second fire were different from their Bronze Age predecessors in ways that would define all future human development. They possessed the same essential capacity for choice and growth, but they were humbled by the knowledge of what had happened to the first human civilization. They understood that their gifts came with responsibilities, that their freedom was bounded by consequences, that their power was meaningful only when exercised in service to something greater than themselves. These new humans became the parents of the age of heroes, producing children who would astound even the gods with their ability to combine mortal limitations with divine aspiration. Heracles, whose strength rivaled that of the gods themselves, but who used that strength in service to justice and redemption. Perseus, who faced monsters that terrified immortals, but did so to protect the innocent rather than to prove his own courage. Theseus, who navigated the labyrinth of political power with the same courage he brought to facing the Minotaur understanding that true heroism required not just physical bravery, but moral clarity. Atalanta, who ran faster than the wind but chose her own path rather than simply accepting the destiny others would impose upon her. Jason, who gathered heroes from across the known world and taught them to work together in pursuit of goals that none could achieve alone. These heroes represented the fulfillment of Zeus's original vision for humanity, beings capable of growth, choice, and nobility who could serve as partners to the gods in the ongoing work of cosmic development. They were mortal, yes, limited by the brevity of their lives and the fragility of their bodies. But within those limitations, they achieved a greatness that in some ways surpassed even divine accomplishment. The gods had never faced death, never experienced the poignancy that comes from knowing that every moment is precious because it cannot last forever. They had never known the particular courage required to act nobly while knowing that failure might mean not just personal destruction, but the loss of everything they loved. The heroes taught the gods that mortality, rather than being simply a limitation, could be the source of a unique and irreplaceable form of greatness. Yet the relationship between gods and heroes was not one of simple admiration or patronage. The heroes challenged the gods in ways that forced divine consciousness itself to grow and evolve. When Heracles chose to sacrifice his own immortality to save others, he demonstrated a form of love that even Zeus found difficult to comprehend. When Antigone defied divine law in service to a higher law written in the human heart, she forced the gods to reconsider the relationship between authority and justice. The Age of Heroes thus became a time of mutual education between divine and mortal consciousness. The gods learned from watching mortals face challenges that immortals could never fully understand, while mortals learned from divine example and guidance how to transform their brief lives into something approaching eternal significance. Each heroic deed became a form of theology, a practical demonstration of how conscious beings could transcend their limitations through choice, courage, and love. The flood and the fire, destruction and creation, punishment and gift. These apparent contradictions revealed the deepest truth about the cosmos Zeus and his siblings had fought to create. Growth required risk, wisdom required experience, love required the possibility of loss. The world could not be made safe for consciousness without destroying the very freedom that made consciousness meaningful. Zeus had flooded the world not because he hated humanity, but because he loved the idea of what humanity could become too much to allow it to be corrupted by what it had actually become. He had allowed Prometheus to give fire again not because he was weak or inconsistent, but because he understood that the divine gift of consciousness required constant renewal. Constant risk, constant faith in the possibility that beings blessed with freedom would choose to use that freedom wisely. The Age of Heroes was thus both the vindication of the Olympian revolution and its greatest test. It proved that consciousness could indeed transcend its origins. That choice could lead to nobility rather than chaos. That mortals and immortals could work together in service to principles greater than either could achieve alone. But it also demonstrated that this achievement would never be automatic, never guaranteed, never safe from the possibility of failure and corruption. In the end, the heroes were Zeus's answer to the question that had haunted him since the first humans had. proven capable of both transcendent nobility and appalling corruption. How could consciousness be preserved without being controlled, guided without being enslaved, inspired without being coerced? The answer lay not in perfect beings who could never fail, but in imperfect beings who could choose to succeed despite their limitations. The Age of Heroes was the age when that choice became not just possible, but actual. When mortals demonstrated that the fire Prometheus had stolen from heaven could indeed be used to light the way toward a form of greatness that even the gods could admire and learn from. It was the beginning of the partnership between divine and mortal consciousness that would define all future cosmic development, love, betrayal, and divine politics. In the marble halls of Olympus, where eternal light cast shadows that danced with the subtlety of divine emotion, the gods discovered something their victory over the Titans had never prepared them for: the intricate politics of sharing power among equals. Zeus sat upon his golden throne, master of thunder and undisputed king of heaven. Yet he could not command the one thing that would prove most dangerous to cosmic order: the hearts of his divine family. The 12 great gods who ruled from Olympus were bound together by blood, marriage, and shared purpose. But these very bonds became the source of conflicts that would reshape both heaven and earth. Unlike the Titans, who had ruled through simple hierarchy and ancient custom, the Olympians governed through a complex web of relationships where personal desire, political necessity, and cosmic responsibility intersected in ways that made every divine emotion a potential catalyst for earthly catastrophe. Hera, queen of heaven and goddess of marriage, embodied the central paradox of Olympian rule. As the divine principle of marital fidelity and family stability, she was essential to the cosmic order Zeus sought to establish. Yet her marriage to the king of gods became the stage upon which the fundamental contradictions of divine nature would play out in ever more dramatic and destructive ways. Zeus's first betrayal came not from malice, but from the very nature of divine consciousness itself. As king of gods and embodiment of cosmic justice, he was drawn to excellence wherever he found it. In goddesses whose beauty rivaled Hera's own, in mortal women whose virtue or talent caught his eternal attention, in nymphs whose wild freedom represented aspects of existence that even divine marriage could not contain. When Zeus descended to earth in the form of a golden shower to court Danae, the bronze tower imprisoned princess of Argos, he was not simply satisfying personal desire, but fulfilling his role as the divine force that brings new possibilities into existence. From their union would come Perseus, the hero whose deeds would prove that divine blood and mortal courage could combine to overcome monsters that threatened both realms. But Hera, watching from Olympus as her husband's golden light penetrated the bronze walls of Danae's prison, felt something more complex than simple jealousy. As goddess of marriage, she understood that Zeus's infidelity was not just personal betrayal, but cosmic contradiction. The king who established divine law was the first to break it. The god who demanded mortal fidelity could not maintain it himself. Hera's revenge upon Danae and her son Perseus became the template for a pattern that would repeat through countless generations of mortals touched by divine intervention. Unable to directly challenge Zeus without undermining the cosmic order they both served, Hera turned her fury upon those mortals who had, willingly or unwillingly, become entangled in her husband's affairs. The infant Perseus, cast into the sea with his mother in a chest of bronze and wood, became the first mortal to learn that divine favor and divine wrath were often the same thing, viewed from different perspectives. Zeus's blessing made him capable of heroic deeds that would save kingdoms and slay monsters. But Hera's enmity ensured that every step of his journey would be fraught with dangers that tested not just his courage, but his very right to exist. Yet the Queen of Heaven discovered that her attempts to destroy the children of Zeus's affairs often achieved the opposite of what she intended. Perseus, hardened by divine persecution, became one of the greatest heroes of his age. The very trials Hera devised to destroy him instead forged him into someone capable of deeds that added to rather than diminished the glory of the divine realm. The pattern became even more complex when Zeus fell in love with Alcmene, the mortal woman whose virtue and beauty caught his attention. While her husband Amphitryon was away at war, to possess her without deception was impossible, for Alcmene's fidelity to her mortal husband was absolute. So Zeus took Amphitryon's form, extending their wedding night to triple its normal length while the real husband remained ignorant of the divine substitution taking place in his own bed. From this union came Heracles, whose very existence was an affront to every principle Hera held sacred. Born from adultery disguised as marital fidelity, blessed with strength that rivaled the gods themselves, destined for deeds that would earn him immortality despite his mortal birth, Heracles represented everything that was wrong with Zeus's inability to control his desires, and everything that was magnificent about the results of divine mortal union. Hera's persecution of Heracles began before his birth, when she sent serpents to strangle him in his cradle, and continued through every day of his mortal life. She drove him to temporary madness that caused him to kill his own wife and children, a crime that required the 12 labors as penance. Yet each labor, designed to destroy him, instead demonstrated capabilities that amazed even the gods who had set them. The irony was not lost on Zeus, who watched his queen unwittingly become his greatest ally in creating heroes worthy of divine attention. Hera's hatred refined what Zeus's love had created, burning away weakness and leaving only the pure gold of heroic virtue. The very intensity of her persecution proved that the mortals she sought to destroy possessed something genuinely threatening to divine prerogative, the ability to earn through suffering what the gods possessed through nature. But the divine politics of Olympus extended far beyond the marriage of Zeus and Hera. Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, found herself perpetually caught between her marriage to Hephaestus, the divine smith whose lameness and devotion to craft represented the stable foundations of civilization, and her irresistible attraction to ours. God of war whose wild passion embodied everything that threatened civilized order. The affair between Aphrodite and Ars was not simply divine adultery, but a cosmic necessity. Love and war, creation and destruction, the forces that build civilization and the forces that tear it down. These opposites required each other to maintain the dynamic tension that kept existence vital and growing. Yet their union also produced consequences that rippled through both divine and mortal realms. When Hephaestus discovered his wife's betrayal, His response revealed the sophisticated nature of divine justice. Rather than exploding in rage or demanding immediate satisfaction, he crafted a net so fine it was invisible, so strong it could hold even gods, so cleverly designed that Aphrodite and Mars would trap themselves in their own passion. When they fell into each other's arms on what they thought was a secret bed, the net enclosed them, displaying their naked embrace to all the gods of Olympus. The laughter that erupted from the assembled deities was not cruel mockery, but recognition of the eternal comedy inherent in divine nature. Even gods, for all their power and wisdom, could be made foolish by desire, could be caught in traps woven from their own appetites, could find themselves exposed and vulnerable despite their cosmic authority. The net of Hephaestus became a symbol of how even divine passion operates within limits, how even immortal desire must face consequences. Yet the children born from the union of Aphrodite and Mars, Phobos and Deimos, fear and panic, who accompanied their father into battle, demonstrated that even illicit divine unions served cosmic purposes. War required not just courage, but the ability to inspire and feel fear, not just strategy, but the capacity for panic that could turn the tide of battle. The goddess of love and the god of war had created offspring who made warfare itself more human, more emotional, more tied to the passions that drove mortal conflict. Apollo, god of light, music, and prophecy, embodied another aspect of divine romantic complexity. His pursuit of the nymph Daphne, daughter of the river god Peneus, began as simple divine desire, but evolved into a tragedy that revealed the fundamental impossibility of forced love. When Daphne, horrified by Apollo's relentless pursuit, prayed to her father for rescue, her transformation into a laurel tree became both salvation and eternal imprisonment. Apollo's response to this rejection, making the laurel his sacred tree, wearing its leaves as crown, decreeing that laurel wreaths would honor poets and victors throughout history, transformed personal loss into cosmic principle. He could not possess Daphne, but he could ensure that her essence would be associated with every human achievement, worthy of divine recognition. His love, denied physical expression, became aesthetic and spiritual inspiration for all future generations. The god of prophecy as romantic failures revealed a deeper truth about divine consciousness. The ability to see the future clearly did not grant the wisdom to change it, or the power to compel love. Apollo could predict every consequence of his pursuit of Daphne, but his foreknowledge only made the tragedy more poignant, not more avoidable. Even divine omniscience had limits when it encountered the irreducible mystery of another being's free will. Athena, virgin goddess of wisdom and warfare, represented the deliberate choice to remain outside the romantic entanglements that complicated the lives of her divine siblings. Her celibacy was not mere preference, but cosmic principle. Wisdom required independence from the emotional bonds that could compromise judgment, and warfare required the clear thinking that passionate attachment made impossible. Yet even Athena could not completely escape the consequences of divine politics, centered around romantic desire. When Hephaestus attempted to rape her, his seed fell upon the earth and gave birth to Erichthonius, a child she neither bore nor conceived, but for whom she nevertheless felt responsibility. Her decision to raise this earth-born child revealed that even chosen independence could not isolate anyone completely from the web of relationships that defined divine existence. The wisdom Athena represented included understanding that her siblings' romantic complications were not simply personal dramas, but expressions of cosmic forces that required balance and integration. Her role became that of counselor and mediator, helping to resolve conflicts that passion had created and passion alone could never solve. Poseidon, lord of earthquakes and horses, storms and sea, brought to divine romance the same tempestuous energy that characterized his natural domain. His pursuit of mortals and immortals alike was marked by the sudden violence of ocean storms and the irresistible power of tidal forces. When he desired the goddess Demeter, she fled from him in the form of a mare, but he became a stallion to pursue her, their union producing the divine horse Arion and establishing the connection between sexuality and the wild forces of nature. Poseidon's rape of Medusa in Athena's temple created one of the most complex moral puzzles in divine history. The sea god's violation of sacred space and virgin priestess was clearly wrong. Yet Athena's punishment fell upon the victim rather than the perpetrator, transforming Medusa into the monster whose gaze turned viewers to stone. This apparent injustice revealed the harsh reality of divine politics. Even goddesses of wisdom sometimes found it easier to punish the powerless than to challenge their powerful peers. Yet Medusa's transformation, while terrible, also became a source of power that would eventually serve justice. Her deadly gaze, born from divine violation and divine wrath, would be the weapon Perseus used to defeat the sea monster, threatening Andromeda, proving that even the most seemingly unjust divine actions could become instruments of eventual heroism and redemption. Artemis, virgin goddess of the hunt and moon, maintained her independence through methods that were both more violent and more successful than her brother Apollo's romantic pursuits. When the hunter Actaeon accidentally saw her bathing, she transformed him into a stag to be torn apart by his own hunting dogs. The message was clear. Divine virginity was not passive purity, but active power that would destroy anyone who violated its boundaries. Yet Artemis also served as protector of young women who sought to remain unmarried, offering them an alternative to the romantic entanglements that seemed to define so much of divine and mortal existence. Her band of hunting nymphs represented the possibility that consciousness could find fulfillment through communion with nature and devotion to purpose rather than through sexual and romantic bonds. The conflicts between Artemis and Aphrodite, who were mortal women who chose hunt over marriage, became proxy wars for larger questions about the nature of feminine fulfillment and divine authority. When Hippolytus rejected Aphrodite's gifts in favor of Artemis's austere hunting life, the goddess of love engineered his destruction through his stepmother Phaedra's passion, proving that even choosing sides in divine politics carried mortal consequences. Demeter, goddess of grain and harvest, experienced divine romance through the lens of maternal love when Hades abducted her daughter, Persephone, to the underworld. Her grief at this loss was so profound that it withdrew fertility from the earth itself, threatening to destroy all mortal life through famine. This was not mere divine tantrum, but cosmic principle, the forces that nurture life could also withdraw that nurturing when fundamental bonds were violated. The resolution of Persephone's abduction required diplomacy that engaged the highest levels of divine authority. Zeus himself had to intervene, decreeing that Persephone would spend part of each year with her husband in the underworld and part with her mother on Earth. This compromise created this seasonal cycle that would govern agricultural life throughout human history. But it also established the principle that some divine conflicts could only be resolved through arrangements that satisfied no one completely while serving the larger needs of cosmic order. The divine politics revealed in these romantic entanglements shaped mortal existence in ways both obvious and subtle. Every love affair between God and mortal created heroes, monsters, or both. Every divine quarrel manifested as natural disaster, plague, or miraculous intervention in human affairs. Every resolution of divine conflict established precedents that would govern how similar situations would be handled throughout future ages. Troy fell because a mortal prince was asked to judge which goddess was most beautiful, and his choice of Aphrodite over Hera and Athena set in motion a war that demonstrated how divine vanity could destroy entire civilizations. The judgment of Paris was not simply about beauty, but about the fundamental question of what divine qualities mortals should value most. Hera's power, Athena's wisdom, or Aphrodite's love. The heroes and heroines who emerged from divine mortal unions carried within themselves the contradictions of their dual nature. They possessed capabilities that exceeded normal human limits, but were driven by passions that often led to their destruction. They served as bridges between mortal and divine consciousness, but found themselves belonging fully to neither realm. Achilles, son of the sea goddess Thetis and the mortal king Peleus, embodied the tragic grandeur that resulted from divine politics intersecting with mortal life. His divine blood made him capable of deeds that would echo through eternity, but his mortal nature ensured that his life would be brief and his death would be final. The very gifts that made him capable of heroism also made that heroism necessary and temporary. The gods themselves evolved through their romantic complications in ways that surprised even divine consciousness. Zeus learned that his infidelities, while satisfying immediate desire, created long-term consequences that complicated every aspect of divine rule. Hera discovered that her attempts to punish her husband's lovers often elevated them to legendary status rather than destroying them. Apollo found that his failures in love taught him more about the nature of desire and loss than his successes in prophecy taught him about the future. In the end, the love affairs, betrayals, and petty rivalries of the Olympian gods revealed that even divine consciousness was subject to growth, change, and the education that comes through relationship and conflict. The gods who had overthrown the Titans to create a more dynamic and responsive cosmic order found themselves changed by that very dynamism in ways they had never anticipated. The mortal world became the stage upon which divine emotions played out their cosmic dramas. But mortals were not merely victims or pawns in these conflicts. The greatest heroes and heroines learned to navigate divine politics, to understand which gods to honor and which to avoid, to recognize that divine favor and divine wrath were often two faces of the same cosmic coin. The Age of Heroes was thus also the age when divine and mortal consciousness learned to coexist and co-evolve, each teaching the other lessons about the nature of power, love, justice, and the eternal struggle to balance personal desire with cosmic responsibility. Through their endless affairs and jealousies, their petty rivalries and grand reconciliations, the gods created a world where every mortal choice carried divine significance, and every divine emotion had mortal consequences. The greatest heroes and their impossible tasks. In the shadow of towering Mount Olympus, where divine light cast mortal shadows that seemed to stretch toward infinity, a bronze-skinned infant strangled to serpents, with hands barely large enough to grasp their writhing coils. This was no ordinary child's triumph over mortal danger. This was the first declaration of war between heroic will and cosmic fate. The opening shot in a battle that would define what it meant to be truly human. In a world ruled by immortal powers, Heracles, whose very name meant glory of Hera, carried within his mortal flesh the ultimate contradiction of the heroic condition. Born from Zeus's union with the mortal woman Alcmene, he possessed strength that rivaled the gods themselves, yet he was cursed by the Queen of Heaven to spend his brief life, proving himself worthy of an immortality that should have been his birthright. Every breath he drew was an act of defiance against a goddess who had decreed his destruction. Before his first cry echoed from his mother's womb, the serpents sent to murder the infant Heracles were not mere snakes, but creatures of divine wrath, instruments of Hera's fury made manifest in the mortal world. When the child's tiny fingers closed around their throats and squeezed until their supernatural life fled, he was not simply surviving an assassination attempt. He was establishing the principle that would govern every moment of his existence, that mortal will, when perfected through suffering, could overcome even divine opposition. But Heracles was not the first to face the terrible mathematics of heroic destiny. Perseus, born in the Bronze Tower, where his mother Danae had been imprisoned, to prevent the prophecy of her son's birth learned from his earliest memories. That heroism was not a choice, but a burden imposed by the intersection of divine politics and mortal consequence. When King Polydex demanded the head of Medusa as an impossible wedding gift, Perseus understood that he was being asked to die gloriously rather than live obscurely. The task was designed to be fatal. Medusa, once a beautiful priestess transformed into a monster whose gaze turned viewers to stone, dwelt in a realm beyond the edge of the world where the very air was thick with the whispers of the dying. Her sisters, the immortal Gorgons, guarded her with claws that could rend divine flesh and wings that rode the winds of chaos itself. To approach her was death. To look upon her was death. To fail in the attempt was merely a longer, more painful form of death. Yet Perseus accepted the task not from bravado or ignorance, but from the peculiar clarity that comes to those who understand that their only choice is between meaningful death and meaningless life. In his bronze shield, polished to mirror brightness, he saw not just Medusa's reflection, but the truth about heroic existence. That greatness requires the willingness to risk everything for principles that transcend personal survival. The gods who aided Perseus, Athena with her shield, Hermes with his winged sandals, Hades with his helmet of invisibility, were not acting from mere favoritism, but from recognition. that the young hero embodied something essential to cosmic order. Perseus represented the principle that mortal consciousness, when refined through impossible challenges, could achieve feats that even immortal power could not accomplish through mere will. When Perseus finally stood before the sleeping Medusa, guided by her reflection in his shield while her deadly gaze remained safely averted, he faced the moment that defines all heroic action, the split second when theory becomes practice, when training meets reality, when the possibility of transcendence confronts the certainty of consequence. His sword-as stroke that severed her head was performed with the precision of divine justice and the courage of mortal desperation combined. From Medusa's blood sprang Pegasus, the winged horse who would carry future heroes toward their own impossible tasks, and Chrysaor, the golden giant who embodied the terrible beauty that could emerge from the union of monster and hero creation and destruction. Perseus had not simply slain a monster, he had transformed cosmic horror into cosmic possibility, proving that heroic action could redeem even the most tragic consequences of divine conflict. Theseus, heir to the throne of Athens, faced a different kind of impossible task when he volunteered to enter the labyrinth of Crete as one of the 14 young Athenians offered as tribute to King Minos. The Minotaur that dwelt at the labyrinth's heart was not just a monster, but a living symbol of the maze that political power created. Half human, half beast, fed on innocent blood, hidden at the center of a puzzle that seemed designed to consume those who attempted to solve it. The labyrinth itself was a masterwork of divine craft, designed by Daedalus with such cunning that even its creator could barely navigate its twisting passages. Its walls shifted when touched. Its passages led to dead ends that were also new beginnings. Its very geometry seemed to change according to the intentions of those who walked its corridors. To enter the labyrinth was to accept that conventional navigation, conventional logic, conventional courage would all prove inadequate. Theseus's thread, provided by Ariadne and wound from the entrance to the Minotaur's lair, was more than a practical tool for finding his way out. It was a symbol of the connection between heroic action and love, between individual courage and the relationships that make that courage meaningful. Without Ariadne's thread, Theseus's victory over the Minotaur would have been Pyrrhic, leaving him trapped forever in the maze he had entered to save others. The battle with the Minotaur was fought not just with sword and strength, but with the understanding that the monster represented the beast within civilization itself, the appetite for innocent blood that political power could develop, the tendency toward predation that lurked at the heart of even the most sophisticated societies. When Theseus's blade found the creature's heart, he was not just saving future Athenian youths, but proving that political leadership could be heroic, that kings could be more than elevated predators. Yet Theseus's greatest triumph contained within itself the seeds of his greatest failure, his abandonment of Ariadne on the island of Naxos. Whether from divine compulsion, political necessity, or simple thoughtlessness, demonstrated that even the most heroic mortals remained tragically human. The thread that had saved him became the symbol of bonds carelessly severed, of love sacrificed to ambition, of the price that heroic destiny exacted from those who became entangled with heroes. Heracles returning to his labors after Theseus had proved that monsters could be defeated through cleverness as well as strength faced challenges. that seemed designed not just to test his capabilities, but to explore the very limits of what mortal will could accomplish. The 12 labors imposed upon him as penance for the murder of his family, a crime committed during divine madness sent by Hera, were not random tests, but a systematic exploration of every form of impossibility. The Nemean lion, whose hide could not be pierced by any mortal weapon, taught Heracles that some problems could only be solved by abandoning conventional approaches entirely. When his arrows, spears, and sword all proved useless, he was forced to wrestle the beast with his bare hands, finally strangling it with the same grip that had killed Hera's serpents in his cradle. The lion's impenetrable hide became his armor, protection earned through the willingness to face the impossible with nothing but mortal strength and immortal determination. The Hydra of Lerna, whose heads multiplied when severed, presented Heracles with the mathematical impossibility of victory. Through straightforward destruction, each head he cut away was replaced by two more, until he faced not one monster, but an ever-growing multitude of snapping, venomous mouths. Only when his nephew Iolaus began cauterizing the neck stumps with burning brands did Heracles learn that some enemies could only be defeated through cooperation, that even the strongest hero required allies to overcome certain forms of opposition. The Augean stables, where Heracles was required to clean 30 years of accumulated filth from the stalls of 3,000 divine cattle in a single day, seemed designed to humiliate rather than challenge. There was no monster to fight, no enemy to overcome, only the mundane reality of cosmic-scale uncleanliness that had to be addressed through simple labor. Yet Heracles' solution, diverting to rivers to wash through the stables, demonstrated that heroic intelligence could transform even the most menial tasks into exercises in creative problem-solving. The Stymphalian birds, whose bronze beaks and claws could pierce any armor, and whose feathers fell like arrows when they took flight, taught Heracles that some battles had to be fought with tools provided by those who had faced similar challenges before. The bronze castanets given to him by Athena created noise that drove the birds into flight, where they became vulnerable to his arrows. Even heroes required mentorship, guidance from those who had wrestled with impossibility and discovered its weaknesses. Jason, gathering heroes for the quest for the Golden Fleece, faced the unique challenge of leadership in a mission where individual heroism would be insufficient. The Argonauts he assembled, Heracles himself, Orpheus the poet whose music could move stones, Castor and Pollux the divine twins, Atalanta the huntress who could outrun the wind, represented every form of human excellence. But their very diversity threatened to tear the expedition apart before it could begin. The journey to Colchis became a masterclass in the politics of heroic collaboration. Each challenge they faced required different heroes to take leadership. Orpheus to sing them past the sirens, the Boreads to drive off the Harpies, Heracles to provide strength when strength was needed. Jason's genius lay not in surpassing his companions, but in recognizing when to step back and allow others to shine, when to assert command, and when to trust in collective wisdom. The Golden Fleece itself, hanging in the grove sacred to Ars, and guarded by a dragon that never slept, represented the ultimate prize that could only be won through the combination of heroic courage and divine favor. When Medea, daughter of King Aetes and granddaughter of the sun god Helios, fell in love with Jason and provided the magic that would make his success possible, the quest revealed another truth about heroic achievement: that even the greatest heroes required not just allies but partners whose own power complemented and completed their own. Yet the story of Jason and Medea also revealed the tragic dimension that shadowed every heroic triumph. Medea's love, which made Jason's victory possible, also bound her to a fate that would ultimately destroy both their lives. When Jason later abandoned her for a younger, more politically advantageous bride, her revenge, murdering their children to ensure that Jason's betrayal would haunt him forever, demonstrated that heroic selfishness could create monsters more terrible than any the heroes had been sent to slay. Achilles, greatest of the warriors who sailed to Troy, embodied the ultimate heroic paradox in his very birth. His mother Thetis, the sea goddess who had been given in marriage to a mortal king to prevent a prophecy that her son would be greater than his father, attempted to make her child immortal by dipping him in the waters of the river Styx. The heel by which she held him remained vulnerable, untouched by the waters of invulnerability, creating in Achilles a being who was almost divine but remained fatally human. The choice offered to Achilles by his divine mother, long life in obscurity or short life crowned with eternal glory, was not really a choice at all for one born with heroic nature. To choose safety would be to deny the very essence of what he was, to accept meaningless longevity rather than meaningful existence. When he chose to go to Troy knowing that he would die there, he was not being reckless, but authentic to the deepest truth about heroic consciousness. The rage of Achilles, which Homer proclaimed as the poem's central theme, was not mere anger but the cosmic force that drove heroic action beyond the boundaries of rational self-interest. When Patroclus, his beloved companion, died wearing Achilles' armor and fighting in his place, the hero's grief transformed into a fury that transcended human emotion and became a natural force, as unstoppable as earthquake or storm. Achilles' pursuit of Hector around the walls of Troy was not just the climax of personal vendetta, but the collision between two different forms of heroic virtue. Hector fought to defend his city, his family, his people, heroism rooted in duty and love of community. Achilles fought to honor his fallen friend and achieve the immortal glory that would make his brief life meaningful. Heroism rooted in individual excellence and personal honor. When Achilles finally killed Hector and dragged his body behind his chariot in full view of the Trojan defenders, he achieved the revenge he sought, but at the cost of his own humanity. The act that satisfied his rage also revealed how heroic passion, unchecked by mercy or wisdom, could transform even the greatest heroes into something monstrous. Only when Priam, Hector's father, came to beg for his son's body did Achilles remember that heroes were still human, still capable of compassion, still bound by the laws that separated civilization from barbarism. Bellerophon, mounted on Pegasus and tasked with slaying the fire-breathing Chimera, faced the unique challenge of aerial combat against a monster that was itself a fusion of impossibilities. Lion, goat, and serpent combined into a single creature that embodied chaos made flesh. His victory required not just courage, but the mastery of flight, the ability to think and fight in 3 dimensions the willingness to trust his life to a winged horse born from the blood of Medusa. Yet Bellerophon's ultimate fate revealed the danger that lurked within every heroic triumph. Success against impossible odds could breed the hubris that led heroes to challenge not just monsters, but gods themselves. When Bellerophon attempted to ride Pegasus, to Olympus itself Zeus sent a gadfly to sting the divine horse, throwing the hero to earth where he wandered blind and lame for the rest of his days. A living reminder that heroic achievement had limits that even heroes ignored at their peril. Orpheus, whose music could move stones and tame wild beasts, faced the most poignant of all impossible tasks when he descended to the underworld to reclaim his beloved Eurydice from death itself. His challenge was not physical, but spiritual, to convince Hades and Persephone that love was stronger than death, that music could accomplish what strength and cunning could not. The song that Orpheus sang in the halls of the dead was more than entertainment or pleading. It was the distillation of every love song ever sung, every lament ever offered for the departed, every human voice raised against the finality of death. When even the Furies wept at his music and Hades agreed to release Eurydice, Orpheus achieved what no hero before him had accomplished: victory over death through art, rather than violence. Yet the condition imposed that Orpheus must not look back at Eurydice until they both reached the world of the living, tested the one quality that no amount of heroic training could provide: faith in invisible love, trust in promises that could not be verified, the ability to resist the very human need, to confirm through sight what the heart believed through hope. When Orpheus turned to look at Eurydice just steps before they reached the surface, losing her forever to his moment of doubt, he discovered the cruelest truth about heroic achievement: that the qualities which made heroes capable of impossible deeds, the need to see clearly, to verify personally, to trust only in what could be proven, could also make them incapable of the simple faith that love required. The price paid by heroes was not just death. Death came to all mortals regardless of their achievements. The price was the isolation that came from transcending normal human limitations, the loneliness of standing apart from those they served, the burden of knowledge that their greatest triumphs often came at the cost of their deepest happiness. Heracles, completing his 12 labors and earning his place among the immortals, discovered that divine status was itself a kind of death, separation from the mortal realm where his struggles had meaning, elevation to a height where his former concerns seemed petty and distant. Perseus, laden with divine gifts and royal honors, found that his victory over Medusa had made him a legend, but also a stranger to ordinary human joy. The heroes chose impossibility not from ignorance of its cost, but from understanding that the alternative, safety, comfort, the ordinary span of mortal years, was itself a form of death for consciousness capable of more. They paid the ultimate price not because they were forced to, but because they recognized that some things were worth any sacrifice, that glory earned through suffering was more valuable than peace purchased through limitation. In the end, the greatest heroes taught both gods and mortals that consciousness itself was heroic, that the mere fact of being aware, of choosing, of striving for something beyond survival was an act of cosmic defiance that made every thinking being a hero of sorts. Their impossible tasks became the templates through which all future consciousness would understand the relationship between limitation and transcendence, between the possible and the meaningful, between safety and glory. The heroes died, but their deaths were not defeats. They were graduations into a form of immortality that even the gods envied, eternal presence in the stories that shaped how future generations would understand courage, love, sacrifice, and the magnificent futility of trying to become more than what nature intended. Through their impossible tasks, they proved that the impossible was simply another word for the not yet achieved, and that the ultimate heroic act was the willingness to attempt it anyway. The Trojan War, when gods choose sides. On the silver shores of the Aegean Sea, where crystal waters reflected the marriage feast of the sea goddess Thetis and the mortal king Peleus, the gods of Olympus gathered to celebrate what should have been the union that would bring peace between divine and mortal realms. The wedding was magnificent beyond mortal comprehension. Ambrosia flowed like wine. Nectar sweetened the air with perfumes that would inspire poets for 1,000 years. And music from Apollo's lyre made the very stones of the shore dance with joy. Yet in the midst of this divine celebration, a single uninvited guest would set in motion the most catastrophic war the world had ever known. Eris, goddess of discord and strife, had been deliberately excluded from the wedding festivities, a slight that revealed the fundamental naivety of the Olympians, who believed that harmony could be achieved simply by refusing to acknowledge the forces that opposed it. The golden apple that Eris cast among the wedding guests bore an inscription that seemed simple, but contained within itself the seeds of cosmic catastrophe to the fairest. 3 words that would transform a celebration into the beginning of a conflict that would rage for 10 years, destroy the greatest city of the ancient world, and teach both gods and mortals that beauty, when it became a matter of divine pride, was the most dangerous force in existence. Hera, queen of heaven and goddess of marriage, saw in the apple not just recognition of beauty, but acknowledgement of her supreme status among the divine powers, as Zeus's wife and the embodiment of royal authority. She believed that divine fairness must ultimately rest on political supremacy. That beauty without power was meaningless ornament, that the apple rightfully belonged to the goddess, who ruled over all others. Athena, virgin goddess of wisdom and warfare, understood the apple as a symbol of the beauty that came from perfect function, flawless strategy, and the aesthetic that emerged when intelligence shaped itself into ideal form. Her beauty was not the softness of physical attraction, but the sharp-edged magnificence of a perfect sword, the elegant mathematics of a battle plan that achieved victory through wisdom, rather than mere force. Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty incarnate, recognized in the apple the acknowledgement of the force that drove all other divine activities, the cosmic power that made even Zeus himself subject to passion's commands. Without beauty, what was power? Without love, what was wisdom? Without desire, what was marriage itself but a cold contract between incompatible beings? The 3 goddesses turned to Zeus, expecting the king of gods to resolve their dispute with the wisdom that had enabled him to overthrow the Titans and establish divine order. But Zeus, perhaps seeing more clearly than his divine consorts the true implications of the choice, recognized that this decision could not be made by divine authority without destroying the very foundations of Olympian rule. To choose Hera would be to acknowledge that divine judgment was subordinate to marital obligation, that the king of gods could not rule impartially when his own wife was involved. To choose Athena would be to declare that beauty was merely the reflection of wisdom, reducing all other divine qualities to aspects of intellectual perfection. To choose Aphrodite would be to admit that even the supreme divine authority was subject to the forces of desire and passion. The solution Zeus proposed seemed clever in its simplicity. Let a mortal judge decide, someone outside the web of divine relationships and obligations. That made impartial judgment impossible. The mortal chosen was Paris' youngest son of King Priam of Troy, a shepherd prince, whose legendary beauty was said to rival that of the gods themselves, whose innocent youth had kept him free from the political complications that might bias his judgment. Yet even this apparently neutral solution contained within itself the mechanisms of catastrophe. Paris was not truly neutral. He was a mortal whose desires could be influenced, whose judgment could be swayed by promises of divine favor, whose humanity made him vulnerable to exactly the forms of corruption that divine impartiality was meant to avoid. When the three goddesses appeared before Paris on the slopes of Mount Ida, where he tended his father's flocks in blissful ignorance of his royal heritage, they came not as neutral candidates for aesthetic judgment, but as cosmic powers, offering to transform his entire existence in exchange for his decision. The beauty contest became something far more dangerous. An auction where divine favor was the currency and mortal desire was the medium of exchange. Hera offered Paris political supremacy beyond anything a mortal prince could imagine. Dominion over all of Asia, authority that would make kings bow before his throne, power that would elevate him above every mortal ruler who had ever lived. Her beauty revealed itself as the magnificence of absolute command, the terrible loveliness of a world ordered according to a single supreme will. Athena promised military glory and wisdom that would make Paris the greatest warrior and strategist of his age. Victories in every battle, solutions to every strategic problem. The kind of fame that would echo through eternity as mortals told stories of his conquests. Her beauty manifested as the perfection of conflict resolved through intelligence. The elegant violence of warfare transformed into art. Aphrodite offered something that seemed smaller but proved infinitely more dangerous. The love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta, whose face would launch 1,000 ships, and whose passion would be worth any price in blood and suffering. The goddess of love understood what her rivals did not, that political power and military glory were meaningless without someone to share them with. That desire was the force that gave meaning to all other achievements. Paris' choice of Aphrodite was not the decision of a shallow youth dazzled by physical beauty, but the recognition by a lonely prince that love was the only divine gift that could transform existence rather than merely decorating it. Power could be lost, military glory could fade, but love promised to change the very nature of what it meant to be alive, to be conscious, to be capable of joy that transcended all limitation. Yet the moment Paris awarded the golden apple to Aphrodite, he set in motion consequences that neither he nor the goddess who had won his judgment could fully control. Love when it operated as a divine force rather than a mortal emotion, followed laws that made individual desire subordinate to cosmic necessity. The love promised to Paris would come, but it would come in a form that would destroy everything he had ever known. Helen of Sparta, the woman whose beauty had inspired Aphrodite's promise, was already married to Menelaus, king of Sparta and brother to Agamemnon, the most powerful ruler in the Greek world. She was not free to give the love that Paris had been promised, not available for the passion that Aphrodite had offered as the prize for divine favor. Yet divine promises, once made, possessed their own terrible momentum. When Paris arrived in Sparta as a diplomatic guest and looked upon Helen for the first time, the fulfillment of Aphrodite's promise began with the inexorable force of natural law. The love that struck both prince and queen was not the gentle affection that grows between compatible souls, but the cosmic passion that reshapes reality to accommodate its own demands. Helen saw in Paris not just a beautiful stranger, but the fulfillment of desires she had never allowed herself to acknowledge. Paris saw in Helen not just the most beautiful woman in the world, but the completion of his own incomplete existence. Their elopement from Sparta was not a simple betrayal of marital vows, but the collision between divine will and mortal law, between the promises of gods and the obligations of civilization. When Helen fled with Paris to Troy, she was following the commands of a goddess whose power transcended all human authority. Yet she was also committing the act that would bring destruction upon everyone she had ever loved. The response of the Greek kings to Helen's abduction revealed how personal injury could become cosmic conflict when it involved those touched by divine favor. Menelaus' call for the retrieval of his wife became a rallying cry for every Greek ruler who had sworn the oath of Tyndareus, the agreement that all of Helen's former suitors would defend whoever became her husband against any threat to their marriage. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and Menelaus' elder brother, saw in the Trojan crisis an opportunity that transcended family loyalty or personal honor. The expedition to retrieve Helen could become the vehicle for Greek expansion into Asia, the means by which the scattered city-states of Greece could be united under his supreme command, the way to transform a collection of rival kingdoms into a true empire. The 1,000 ships that gathered at the port of Aulis represented more than a rescue mission. They constituted the largest military force the world had ever seen, a floating city of warriors drawn from every corner of the Greek world. Yet this magnificent armada found itself trapped in port by adverse winds that refused to change regardless of sacrifice or prayer. Divine obstruction that revealed how the gods themselves had become divided by the conflict Paris' judgment had initiated. Artemis, virgin goddess of the hunt, had taken offense at Agamemnon's boast that he was a better archer than the divine huntress herself. Her winds held the Greek fleet captive until the King of Kings agreed to sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia, to appease divine wrath. The price demanded for divine favor revealed how quickly the noble mission to retrieve Helen had transformed into something that required the sacrifice of innocence itself. The sacrifice of Iphigenia on the altar of Artemis marked the moment when the Trojan expedition crossed the line between justice and atrocity, between righteous war and cosmic catastrophe. When Agamemnon raised the knife over his daughter's throat, he was not just appeasing an angry goddess, but establishing the principle that would govern the entire conflict. No price was too high for victory, no sacrifice too terrible for glory, no atrocity too great for the satisfaction of divine and mortal pride. Yet even as Iphigenia's blood stained the altar, and the winds began to blow toward Troy, the gods of Olympus found themselves choosing sides in a conflict that would test the very foundations of divine unity. The beauty contest that had begun the crisis had revealed fundamental disagreements among the immortals about the nature of beauty, power, and justice that could not be resolved through simple judgment. Hera and Athena, the goddesses Paris had rejected, threw their divine influence behind the Greek cause with a fury that had less to do with Helene's fate than with their own wounded pride. They had offered genuine divine gifts and been spurned in favor of love, wisdom and power dismissed in favor of passion. Their support for the Greeks became a way of proving that beauty without strength and intelligence was ultimately destructive. Aphrodite naturally favored Troy, protecting the city that sheltered the love she had promised and the lovers whose passion had fulfilled her divine word. But her protection came with the same dangerous intensity that had made their love possible. In the first place, fierce, possessive, and utterly indifferent to the suffering it caused others, Apollo, god of light and prophecy, found himself torn between divine family loyalty and cosmic justice. His priest Chryses had been dishonored by the Greeks, his sacred city of Troy threatened with destruction. Yet his sister Artemis had received this sacrifice she demanded for favorable winds. His support for Troy became a way of asserting divine dignity against mortal presumption. Poseidon, lord of earthquakes and seas, supported the Greeks partly from ancient resentment against Troy. King Laomedon had refused to pay him for building the city's walls, and partly from recognition that Greek naval power represented the future of Mediterranean civilization. His earthquakes and storms aided Greek strategy while demonstrating divine power over the natural forces that shaped warfare. Ars, god of warfare itself, fought sometimes for Troy and sometimes for Greece, his loyalty shifting according to the passion of individual battles. Rather than consistent strategic allegiance, he embodied the truth that war, once unleashed, developed its own momentum independent of the causes that had created it. That violence became an end in itself rather than a means to achieve justice. The siege of Troy became a laboratory for testing every form of heroic virtue and divine intervention. Achilles, greatest of the Greek warriors, brought to the conflict a fury that transcended mere military skill and became a force of nature. His rage at Agamemnon's theft of his prize, the captive Briseis, revealed how quickly the alliance of heroes could dissolve into personal vendettas that threatened the entire war effort. Hector, greatest of the Trojan defenders, embodied a different kind of heroism: duty rather than glory, love of family rather than pursuit of fame, the courage that came from protecting something precious rather than seeking something distant. His presence on the battlefield made Troy's defense not just military strategy, but moral necessity, the protection of civilization itself against the chaos that war inevitably brought. The duel between Paris and Menelaus should have ended the war before it truly began, settling the personal dispute that had caused the conflict through single combat between the injured husband and the man who had stolen his wife. Yet when Aphrodite rescued Paris from certain defeat, spiriting him away from the battlefield in a cloud of divine protection, she demonstrated that the war had already transcended its original causes and become something larger and more terrible. The intervention of gods in mortal combat transformed every battle into a theological dispute, every victory into divine vindication, every defeat into cosmic injustice. When Diomedes wounded both Aphrodite and Ars during his Aristia, wounding divine flesh with mortal bronze, he proved that heroes at their peak could challenge even immortal authority, but also that such challenges brought consequences that extended far beyond individual achievement. The death of Patroclus, wearing Achilles' armor and fighting in his place, became the emotional center around which the entire war pivoted. Hector's killing of Achilles' beloved companion transformed the Greek hero's personal withdrawal from the fighting into cosmic rage that would reshape the conflict's final phase. The armor stripped from Patroclus' body became a symbol of how war corrupted everything it touched, turning even friendship into the occasion for greater violence. Achilles' return to battle, clad in divine armor forged by Hephaestus himself, represented the moment when mortal fury achieved divine sanction and cosmic scope. His slaughter of Trojans as he pursued Hector around the city walls was not just vengeance, but natural catastrophe, human emotion elevated to the level of earthquake or storm. Individual grief transformed into universal destruction. The ransom of Hector's body, when King Priam crossed enemy lines to beg for his son's corpse, revealed the human core that still existed within the cosmic conflict. The scene of aged father pleading with young hero, enemy begging mercy from enemy, represented the possibility that even war could not completely destroy the bonds that made civilization possible. Yet the war continued beyond Hector's death, beyond Achilles' own fall to Paris' arrow guided by Apollo's hand, beyond the rational objectives that had originally motivated the conflict. The Trojan horse, Odysseus' masterpiece of deceptive strategy, succeeded not because it was militarily superior, but because Troy itself had been exhausted by 10 years of divine conflict, worn down by the constant pressure of immortal attention. The fall of Troy, when it finally came, was not a clean victory of justice over injustice, but a catastrophe that consumed victors and vanquished alike. The Greeks sacked the city with a savagery that horrified even the gods who had supported them, violating temples, murdering suppliants, enslaving the innocent. The prize they had sought for 10 years turned to ashes in their hands, as they discovered that victory achieved through such means was indistinguishable from defeat. The returns of the Greek heroes revealed the ultimate cost of divine favor, purchased through mortal suffering. Agamemnon came home to be murdered by his wife Clytemnestra, who had never forgiven him for sacrificing their daughter Iphigenia. Menelaus recovered Helen, but spent years wandering the Mediterranean. Their reunion as problematic as their original separation had been. Odysseus, whose clever strategies had won the war, found himself cursed to wander for 10 more years as Poseidon punished him for blinding the Cyclops Polyphemus. The intelligence that had made him invaluable as a warrior made him dangerous. as a subject of divine wrath, too clever for his own good in a world where gods demanded simplicity of submission. The beauty contest that had begun the entire catastrophe was revealed in its aftermath to have been less about beauty than about the fundamental incompatibility of divine values. When forced into direct competition, Hera's power, Athena's wisdom, and Aphrodite's love were all necessary for cosmic order. But when they competed rather than cooperated, they transformed blessing into curse, protection into destruction, divine favor into mortal catastrophe. The golden apple of Eris had succeeded beyond its creator's wildest dreams, proving that discord was not the opposite of harmony, but its necessary companion, the force that prevented divine consensus from becoming divine tyranny. The war had taught gods and mortals alike that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the successful management of the conflicts that consciousness itself made inevitable. Troy fell, but the story of Troy lived on, becoming the template through which future generations would understand the relationship between beauty and destruction, love and war, divine favor and mortal suffering. The city's destruction had purchased wisdom about the price of perfection, the danger of absolutes, and the terrible beauty that could emerge when gods chose sides in mortal conflicts. The greatest city in the ancient world had been destroyed not by superior military force, but by the collision of incompatible divine visions of what made existence beautiful, meaningful, and worth fighting for. The contest between three goddesses had escalated into cosmic war because beauty itself, when claimed exclusively rather than shared universally, became the most destructive force in existence, more dangerous than power, more devastating than wisdom, more terrible than love itself when love forgot mercy, curses, prophecies, and inescapable fate. In the depths of a cave that existed before time began, where darkness held weight and silence had texture, three ancient figures bent over a loom that stretched beyond the boundaries of mortal comprehension. Clotho the spinner drew forth threads of existence from the void itself, each strand containing the essence of a life yet to be lived. Lachesis the allotter measured each thread with divine precision, determining the length and pattern of every destiny. Apollo the inevitable raised her terrible shears, and where they cut, life ended with finality that even gods could not reverse. These were the Moirae, the Fates, older than Zeus himself, more fundamental than the Olympian order, more inescapable than death. Their loom was the mechanism of destiny itself, and the tapestry they wove contained every story that had ever been or ever would be. Each thread they spun was simultaneously a life and a story, a destiny and a choice, a beginning and an end already determined before the first breath was drawn. Yet the greatest mystery of the Fates was not their power, but their purpose. Did they weave the pattern of existence according to some cosmic plan? Or were they themselves bound by laws even more ancient and inexorable? When Clotho spun the thread of a hero's life, was she creating that destiny or simply revealing what had always been inevitable? When Apollo cut a thread short, was she causing death or merely acknowledging what was already complete? The first prophecy ever spoken emerged not from divine oracle, but from the Fates themselves spoken to Zeus before his war against the Titans. The order you establish will be overthrown by forces. You cannot see in ways you cannot prevent at a time you cannot predict. This was not curse but cosmic law, the fundamental principle that even divine power operated within limitations that made growth, change, and eventual transcendence inevitable. Zeus, hearing this prophecy, faced the choice that would define divine consciousness for all future ages. He could attempt to prevent the prophecy through control and suppression, as his father Cronus had done when told that one of his children would overthrow him. Or he could accept the prophecy and seek to fulfill it in ways that served, rather than destroyed the cosmic order he was establishing. The wisdom of Zeus lay in his recognition that fighting destiny was the surest way to ensure its fulfillment in the most destructive possible form. Instead of trying to prevent change, he would guide it. Instead of avoiding the future, he would participate in creating it. Instead of being destroyed by prophecy, he would use prophecy as a tool for constructive transformation rather than mere preservation of existing power. The oracle at Delphi became Zeus's answer to the problem of prophecy. Rather than keeping knowledge of the future secret and allowing it to operate through blind chance and uncontrolled surprise, he would make prophecy available to both gods and mortals, so that destiny could be approached with wisdom rather than ignorance. Apollo, god of light and knowledge, became the guardian of prophetic truth, ensuring that the future would be revealed in ways that educated rather than merely terrified those who sought guidance. Yet the oracle's prophecies revealed the profound complexity of fate as a cosmic force. The priestess spoke truth, but truth filtered through divine consciousness and expressed in language that required interpretation. Her words were always accurate, but never simple, always honest, but never complete. Those who consulted the oracle received genuine knowledge of their destiny, but knowledge that demanded wisdom to understand and courage to accept. When King Laius of Thebes consulted the oracle about his childless marriage, he received a prophecy that would become the template for all future encounters. Between human desire and cosmic destiny, you will have a son, but that son will kill you and marry your wife. The prophecy offered him exactly what he had requested, knowledge of his future, but wrapped that knowledge in horror that made the gift seem like a curse. Laius's response revealed the tragic flaw that made prophetic destiny inevitable. Rather than accepting the oracle's words and seeking to understand how they might be fulfilled in ways that served rather than destroyed his kingdom, he attempted to prevent the prophecy through violence. When his son Oedipus was born, Laius ordered the infant's feet pierced and the child exposed on a mountainside to die, believing that murder could outwit destiny. But destiny, as the fates had woven it, operated through irony that made every attempt to escape fate into a step toward its fulfillment. The shepherd charged with exposing the infant took pity on the helpless child and gave him to another shepherd, who delivered him to the childless king and queen of Corinth. Oedipus grew to manhood believing himself the son of Polybus and Merope, ignorant of his true parentage, but carrying within himself the very qualities that would make the prophecy inevitable. The oracle's second prophecy, delivered to the adult Oedipus when he consulted Delphi about his parentage, revealed how divine truth operated through partial knowledge rather than complete revelation. "You will kill your father and marry your mother," the priestess declared, speaking absolute truth, but providing no context that would allow Oedipus to understand that the parents he sought to protect were not his biological parents at all. Oedipus's flight from Corinth, motivated by his desperate desire to protect Polybus and emerge from the fate the oracle had revealed, became the mechanism that brought him face to face with his actual destiny. At the crossroads where three paths met, he encountered Laius traveling toward Delphi and killed him in a dispute over right-of-way, fulfilling the first half of the prophecy through an act of justifiable self-defense that neither man recognized as the climax of cosmic destiny. The Sphinx that guarded Thebes after Laius's death represented destiny in its riddle form, truth disguised as puzzle, a fate that could only be approached through intelligence rather than force. Her famous riddle, what goes on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening, was not mere wordplay, but a compressed description of the human condition itself. The trajectory of consciousness from helpless infancy through capable maturity to dependent old age. Oedipus's correct answer, man, demonstrated the intelligence that made him capable of ruling Thebe. Wisely, but it also revealed his tragic inability to apply that same intelligence to understanding his own nature and destiny. He could solve the riddle of human existence in general, but remained blind to the specific pattern of his own life, could see clearly into abstract truth, but could not perceive the concrete reality of his own identity. His marriage to Jocasta, widow of the murdered king, completed the oracle's prophecy through an act of apparent virtue and wisdom. The union was politically necessary to stabilize the kingdom, personally satisfying to both participants and socially beneficial to the people of Thebes. Yet this marriage, which seemed to represent the triumph of intelligence and justice over chaos and uncertainty, was actually the final thread in the pattern the fates had been weaving since before Oedipus's birth. The plague that struck Thebes years later, killing crops and cattle and children while Oedipus ruled as a wise and beloved king, represented the cosmic mechanism by which hidden truth eventually demanded recognition. Apollo's oracle declared that the plague would end only when the murderer of Laius was discovered and punished, setting in motion the investigation that would reveal the terrible irony of Oedipus's success. The gradual revelation of truth, as witnesses came forward and evidence accumulated, demonstrated how destiny operated not through sudden reversal, but through the patient accumulation of consequences that made denial increasingly impossible. Each new piece of information brought Oedipus closer to understanding that his attempts to escape fate had been the very mechanisms of its fulfillment, that his intelligence and virtue had been tools in the hands of forces he had never understood. When the truth finally emerged in all its terrible completeness, that Oedipus had indeed killed his father and married his mother, that his children were also his siblings, that his kingdom's salvation had been built upon the very crimes he had sought to avoid. The revelation destroyed more than just one man's life. It shattered the illusion that intelligence alone could master destiny, that good intentions could overcome cosmic law, that human consciousness could transcend the patterns in which it was embedded. Jocasta's suicide and Oedipus's self-blinding were not just personal responses to unbearable knowledge, but symbolic representations of how consciousness dealt with the discovery of its own limitations. Jocasta chose death rather than existence in a reality where love had become horror, while Oedipus chose blindness rather than continued sight of a world where his greatest achievements had been his greatest crimes. Yet even in their destruction, Oedipus and Jocasta demonstrated that human consciousness possessed something that fate itself could not touch: the ability to choose how to respond to destiny, even when that destiny could not be changed. Their tragic choices were still choices, expressions of will that remained free even when circumstances had become completely determined. The curse that Oedipus pronounced upon his sons before his death, that they would kill each other fighting for the throne of Thebes, revealed how prophecy could become a creative force, how knowledge of the future could actually help to shape that future, rather than merely predicting it. The curse was not just a prediction, but a program. Not just a warning, but a destiny imposed through the power of prophetic speech. Eteocles and Polynices, the sons of Oedipus, found themselves bound not just by their father's curse, but by their own responses to that curse. Their agreement to rule Thebes in alternating years might have satisfied justice and prevented the civil war their father had prophesied. But their mutual distrust and competitive pride made cooperation impossible. Each brother's fear that the other would betray their agreement created the very conditions that made betrayal inevitable. The Seven against Thebes, the war that erupted when Polynices enlisted foreign allies to claim his right to rule, became a demonstration of how prophecy operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The conflict fulfilled Oedipus's curse on his sons, but it also served larger cosmic purposes, testing the limits of family loyalty, exploring the relationship between justice and power, revealing the consequences of attempting to solve political problems through violence. Each of the seven champions who joined Polynices in his attack on Thebes carried their own prophetic burden, their own relationship with destiny that made their participation in the war both choice and compulsion. Amphiaraus, the prophet warrior who foresaw his own death in the conflict, joined the expedition because divine law required him to honor his wife's wishes, even when those wishes led to destruction. The mutual killing of Eteocles and Polynices at the seventh gate of Thebes fulfilled Oedipus' curse with mathematical precision, but their deaths also revealed the creative dimension of prophetic fulfillment. Their choice to meet in single combat, rather than allowing their armies to destroy each other completely, was an act of heroic responsibility that limited the destruction their conflict caused, while still satisfying the demands of destiny. Antigone, daughter and sister of Oedipus, faced a different kind of prophetic destiny when King Creon decreed that Polynices should remain unburied as punishment for his attack on Thebes. Her choice to bury her brother despite the death penalty represented the collision between human law and divine law, between political necessity and religious duty, between the authority of rulers and the authority of conscience. The prophecy that guided Antigone was not spoken by any oracle, but written in her heart as moral law. The dead must be honored. Family bonds transcend political loyalty. Some duties are higher than obedience to human authority. Her decision to bury Polynices was simultaneously free choice and cosmic compulsion, personal will and divine command. Creon's response to Antigone's defiance revealed how political power could become its own form of fate. trapping rulers in patterns of action that logic and necessity seemed to demand, but that led inevitably to destruction. His punishment of Antigone was politically rational, but morally catastrophic. Legally justified but cosmically wrong. The prophet Tyre-Sires, appearing to warn Creon that the gods were angry about Polynus's unburied corpse, represented the intersection of divine knowledge and human choice that made prophecy meaningful rather than simply deterministic. Tyre-Sires offered Creon the opportunity to change course, to avoid the destruction that divine wrath would bring. But only if the king could overcome his pride and admit error. Creon's eventual decision to reverse his decree and free Antigone came too late to prevent the cascade of destruction that prophecy had warned against. Antigone hanged herself rather than wait for rescue. Haemon killed himself rather than live without his betrothed. And Eurydice took her own life rather than survive the loss of her son. The king's attempt to master fate through absolute authority had created the very chaos that authority was meant to prevent. Yet the story of the House of Thebes revealed that even the most terrible prophecies served constructive cosmic purposes. When viewed from sufficient perspective, the curse that destroyed 3 generations of the royal family also purged Thebes of the pollution that had accumulated through generations of violence and deception, creating the possibility for renewal and regeneration. Perseus faced prophecy of a different kind when the oracle told his grandfather Acrisius that he would be killed by his own grandson. The prophecy contained no moral judgment, no suggestion that the death would be punishment for crime or result of character flaw. It was simply a statement of cosmic fact, destiny operating as natural law rather than divine justice. Acrisius's response, imprisoning his daughter Danae in a bronze tower to prevent her from conceiving, demonstrated the futility of attempting to prevent prophecy through physical force. Zeus's arrival as a shower of gold proved that divine will could penetrate any barrier human ingenuity could devise. That prophecy operated through cosmic forces too fundamental to be blocked by mere architecture. Perseus's accidental killing of Acrisius during athletic games, when a discus thrown in competition was caught by the wind and struck the old king in the head, revealed the most mysterious aspect of prophetic destiny, its tendency to fulfill itself through chance events that seemed completely unrelated to the original prophecy. The death appeared random, but randomness itself was part of the pattern that the fates had woven. The greatest prophetic destiny in all mythology belonged to Troy itself, the city doomed not by any crime or curse, but by the simple fact that its existence represented a challenge to Greek expansion that destiny had decreed must be resolved through war. The prophecy that Troy would fall was not punishment, but cosmic necessity, the working out of historical forces that individual choice could delay, but not ultimately prevent. Cassandra, daughter of King Priam, received from Apollo the gift of true prophecy coupled with the curse that no one would believe her warnings. Her tragic fate revealed the most cruel aspect of prophetic knowledge, understanding exactly what would happen while being powerless to prevent it, seeing clearly while surrounded by those who chose blindness. When Cassandra warned that the Trojan horse contained Greek warriors, when she prophesied that accepting the supposed offering would lead to the city's destruction, she spoke absolute truth that her own people dismissed as madness. Her curse made her a living demonstration of how prophecy operated. Always true, usually ignored, inevitably fulfilled despite all warnings. The fall of Troy proved that even divine favor could not overcome destiny when that destiny served larger cosmic purposes. The gods who protected this city fought valiantly for their chosen people, but they could not prevent the outcome that higher laws had already determined. Troy's destruction was not defeat, but graduation. Not ending but transformation into the eternal story that would educate all future civilizations. About the relationship between pride and fall, love and war, human ambition and cosmic law. In the end, the question of whether anyone could escape destiny revealed itself to be the wrong question. Destiny was not a prison but a possibility, not a limitation, but a creative force that made growth and meaning possible. The fates did not weave arbitrary patterns, but cosmic law. Not random events, but the deep structure of consciousness itself as it evolved through time, and choice toward ever greater complexity and beauty. The threads they spun were not chains, but opportunities. Not predetermination, but the promise that existence itself had meaning, direction, and purpose that transcended individual understanding while still honoring individual choice. Even Atroposa's shears, cutting each thread at its appointed length, served not death, but completion, not ending but fulfillment of the pattern that made each life a unique and irreplaceable contribution to the cosmic tapestry. Those who fought their destiny discovered its power, while those who embraced their destiny discovered their freedom. The fates had woven not a trap, but a dance, and the music that guided that dance was the same cosmic harmony that had first called order out of chaos and consciousness out of void. To accept fate was not to surrender choice, but to align choice with forces greater than individual will, making every decision part of a pattern beautiful beyond individual comprehension, yet dependent on individual participation for its realization. The underworld and what lies beyond death. In the deepest caverns beneath the earth where the light of Helios had never penetrated, and the songs of birds gave way to the whispers of eternal winds, there stood gates of adamantine and iron that marked the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. These were not mere barriers, but cosmic membranes that separated to fundamentally different modes of existence, to forms of consciousness so alien to each other. That passage between them required nothing less than the transformation of the soul itself. Hades, lord of the underworld and brother to Zeus, ruled a kingdom that was both the most necessary and most feared of all divine realms. While his brothers commanded the bright spaces of sky and sea, Hades governed the dark territories where all consciousness eventually traveled, where every story reached its conclusion, where the accounts of mortal existence were finally balanced according to laws that operated beyond the reach of prayer or sacrifice. The journey to Hades began not with death itself, but with the moment when the soul released from its mortal shell first encountered Hermes Psychopompos, the guide of souls whose winged sandals could traverse the boundary between life and death. As easily as stepping from one room to another, Hermes appeared to the newly dead not as the clever messenger of Olympian politics, but as the compassionate conductor who would lead consciousness through its most profound transformation. The river Styx, which encircled the underworld like a moat of liquid darkness, was more than a geographical boundary. It was the manifestation of oath itself made liquid, the divine force that bound even gods to their promises. Its waters carried the weight of every vow ever sworn, every contract ever sealed, every bond ever forged between conscious beings. To cross the Styx was to enter a realm where words had absolute power, where intentions became irreversible reality. Charon, the ancient ferryman whose boat had carried souls across the Styx since before Zeus claimed his throne, demanded payment not from greed but from cosmic necessity. The coin placed beneath the tongue of the dead was not mere currency, but a symbol of value recognized, of worth acknowledged, of consciousness that had accumulated meaning during its mortal existence. Those who died without proper burial, without the coin of passage, wandered the shores of Styx for 100 years, not as punishment, but as preparation. Time needed to understand what it meant to be dead before proceeding to judgment. Yet the Styx was only the first of 5 rivers that defined the geography of the underworld, each representing a different aspect of the death experience. Charon, the river of woe, carried the tears of all who had ever mourned, its waters bitter with the salt of separation and loss. Cocytus, the river of lamentation, echoed with the cries of souls discovering the full weight of their earthly choices. Phlegeton burned with fires that consumed not flesh but illusion, stripping away the comfortable deceptions that had made mortal life bearable. Lethe, most merciful of the underworld streams, offered forgetfulness to those whose memories had become unbearable burdens. The palace of Hades stood at the convergence of these rivers, built from stones that had never known sunlight and decorated with gems that glowed with their own inner fire. Here ruled the king and queen of the dead, Hades himself, whose name mortals feared to speak aloud, and Persephone, whose annual return to the upper world made spring possible, but whose primary allegiance belonged to the realm of shadows. Persephone's dual nature, goddess of spring flowers and queen of the dead, embodied the central mystery of the underworld, that death was not the opposite of life, but its completion, not the end of growth, but its culmination in perfect understanding. Her throne beside Hades was carved from a single black diamond that reflected not light but truth, showing each soul who approached exactly what their mortal existence had accomplished and what it had cost. The judgment of souls represented the most sophisticated court of justice ever conceived, where 3 judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, evaluated not actions alone, but intentions, not just deeds, but the understanding behind those deeds, not merely what souls had done, but what they had chosen to become through their doing. These were not arbitrary punishments imposed by cosmic tyrants, but natural consequences flowing from the essential nature of consciousness itself. Minos, king of Crete in life and chief judge in death, possessed the ability to see through every form of self-deception, every rationalization that souls used to justify their earthly choices. His questions stripped away pretense and revealed the core motivations that had driven mortal behavior, the deep values that had shaped a lifetime of decisions. Before Minos, souls could not lie because truth became visible, could not hide because shadows disappeared in the light of perfect judgment. Rhadamanthus specialized in cases involving divine law, the cosmic principles that governed the relationship between mortals and immortals. the proper boundaries of human ambition and divine favor. His court heard the cases of heroes who had overstepped their bounds, mortals who had claimed divine prerogatives, rulers who had forgotten that earthly power was temporary stewardship rather than permanent possession. Aeacus judged the Europeans, but his jurisdiction extended beyond mere geography to include all souls whose primary orientation had been toward justice, law, and the preservation of civilized order. His were the difficult cases where duty and love conflicted, where legal obligation and moral truth pointed in different directions, where souls had been forced to choose between competing forms of righteousness. The verdicts of these judges determined not just punishment or reward, but the very form that consciousness would take in its eternal existence. The underworld was not a single destination, but a complex realm with regions as different from each other as Earth was from sky, each designed to provide the exact conditions that different types of souls required for their continued development. Elysium, the blessed fields where heroes and the virtuous dwelt in eternal happiness, was not a place of passive pleasure, but active engagement with the highest forms of beauty, truth, and goodness. Here Achilles could pursue military excellence without causing suffering. Here poets could compose verses that captured perfect beauty. Here lovers could experience union that transcended all limitation. Yet even Elysium was not final. Souls who achieved perfection here could choose to be reborn, to return to mortal existence and attempt even greater heights of achievement. The asphodel meadows, where ordinary souls spent eternity, were neither paradise nor punishment, but a realm of gentle twilight where consciousness continued its existence in forms appropriate to its earthly development. Here the vast majority of human souls found peace in activities that reflected their mortal interests and capabilities, but refined and purified of the suffering that had accompanied earthly existence. But it was Tartarus, the deepest pit of the underworld, that revealed most clearly the cosmic principles underlying divine justice. This was not a place of arbitrary torture, but a realm where consciousness encountered the full consequences of its choices magnified to eternal proportions. The punishments inflicted here were not vengeance, but education. Not cruelty, but truth made manifest in forms that could not be ignored or rationalized away. Tantalus, who had murdered his own son and served the flesh to the gods as a test of their omniscience, stood forever in water that receded when he tried to drink beneath fruit trees that pulled away. When he reached for their branches, his punishment was not thirst or hunger, but the eternal experience of his own character, made manifest, the insatiable appetite that could never be satisfied, because it was directed toward fundamentally inappropriate objects. Sisyphus, who had cheated death itself through clever schemes, and had believed that intelligence could overcome any cosmic law, spent eternity pushing a boulder up a mountain, only to watch it roll back down each time he neared the summit. His punishment was not futile labor, but the eternal demonstration that effort without wisdom, cleverness without moral understanding, achievement without proper foundation could never reach completion. Ixion, bound to a wheel of fire that spun eternally through the underworld sky, experienced the cosmic consequences of his attempt to seduce Hera, Queen of Heaven. His punishment revealed that some desires, when pursued beyond appropriate boundaries, became forms of spiritual fire that consumed the very consciousness that harbored them. The Danaids, condemned to fill leaky jars with water for eternity, demonstrated the futility of actions performed without understanding their true purpose. Their punishment, endless labor that could never achieve completion, reflected their earthly crime of murdering their husbands on their wedding night. Actions that had violated the cosmic principle that made marriage a sacred bond between souls. Yet even in Tartarus, punishment was not endless vindictiveness, but eternal opportunity for understanding. The suffering experienced there was designed to burn away the illusions and self-deceptions that had made destructive choices seem reasonable, to reveal the cosmic laws that consciousness must acknowledge before it could progress to higher forms of existence. The geography of the underworld included regions that defied mortal understanding, places where the very nature of space and time operated according to different principles. The mourning fields held souls who had died for love, experiencing eternal melancholy that was itself a form of beauty, sorrow refined into aesthetic perfection. The warrior's path provided eternal battles for those whose nature found fulfillment only in conflict, but battles where no one was truly harmed and victory was shared by all participants. Orpheus, the poet-musician whose song could move stones and tame wild beasts, became the first living mortal to successfully journey to the underworld and return with knowledge of its true nature. His descent to reclaim his beloved Eurydice revealed that the realm of the dead was not closed to life, but required a different form of approach, not conquest, but persuasion, not force, but art. The song that Orpheus sang before Hades and Persephone was more than entertainment or pleading. It was the distillation of every love song ever composed, every expression of loss and longing that consciousness had ever produced. When even the Furies wept at his music, and the tormented souls of Tartarus paused in their eternal punishments to listen, Orpheus proved that beauty could transcend the boundary between life and death, that art could accomplish what strength and cunning could not. The condition imposed for Eurydice's release, that Orpheus must not look back at her until they both reached the world of the living, tested the fundamental nature of trust and faith that love required. The underworld could restore the dead to life, but only for those who could love without the need for constant verification, who could maintain faith in invisible presence, who could trust in promises that could not be proven. Orpheus's failure, his glance backward at Eurydice just steps before they reached the surface, revealed the tragic limitation of even the most transcendent love. When it operated through mortal consciousness, his loss of Eurydice forever demonstrated that some gifts could only be received by those who had learned to want them less than they deserved them, who could hold lightly what they valued most deeply. Heracles, during his 12th labor, descended to the underworld to capture Cerberus, the three-headed hound that guarded the gates of Hades. His success in this task, the only labor that required him to enter the realm of the dead while still alive, proved that heroic virtue could triumph even over death itself, but only when that virtue was exercised with proper respect for cosmic law. Hades permitted Heracles to take Cerberus only on the condition that the hero subdue the beast without weapons, using only his strength and courage. This requirement acknowledged that The underworld's guardians could not be defeated through violence, but only through the demonstration of character that transcended the need for external tools or divine favor. The temporary removal of Cerberus from his post allowed living souls to glimpse the underworld directly, to see for themselves the reality that awaited all consciousness beyond the boundary of mortal existence. This revelation served not to terrify but to educate, providing the knowledge that made earthly choices meaningful. Through understanding of their eternal consequences, Psyche, the mortal woman who became the goddess of the soul, journeyed to the underworld to obtain beauty from Persephone as part of her trials, to win back Cupid's love. Her success in this task demonstrated that love could survive even the encounter with death. That consciousness refined through suffering could achieve divine status through its own efforts. The beauty that Psyche brought back from the underworld was not cosmetic enhancement, but the radiance that came from understanding the true nature of existence. The glow that consciousness acquired when it had faced ultimate reality and found itself capable of love even in the presence of mortality and loss. The Greeks' fascination with the underworld reflected their understanding that death was not the enemy of life but its teacher, not the end of meaning but the context that made meaning possible. Mortal existence derived its urgency and beauty from the knowledge that it was temporary. Its choices gained weight from the understanding that they had eternal consequences. The mysteries of Eleusis, the secret religious rituals that promised initiates happiness in the afterlife, provided glimpses of underworld knowledge that transformed how participants understood their mortal existence. Those who had experienced the Eleusinian mysteries reported that death had lost its terror, because they had learned that consciousness continued beyond bodily existence, refined and purified, but essentially unchanged in its capacity for growth and understanding. The philosophers who came after the myth makers, Plato foremost among them, recognized in the mythological underworld a sophisticated exploration of consciousness itself, its structure, its possibilities, its relationship to justice and beauty and truth. The geography of Hades became a map of the soul's potential destinations, the punishments and rewards, eternal consequences of choices made by consciousness that had finally encountered the full truth about its own nature. In the end, the underworld revealed itself to be not a place of ending but of completion, not a realm of punishment but of understanding, not the opposite of life but its culmination in perfect knowledge. The terror that mortals felt when contemplating death was not fear of non-existence, but recognition of the awesome responsibility that came with consciousness, capable of eternal consequences. Hades ruled not as a tyrant, but as the final teacher, the judge who revealed to each soul exactly what its earthly choices had created, the guide who showed consciousness the next step in its eternal journey toward ever greater forms of beauty, truth, and love. His realm was terrible only to those who had lived without understanding, beautiful beyond description to those who had learned that existence itself was sacred. That choice mattered, that consciousness was the greatest gift the universe could bestow. The darkness of the underworld was not the absence of light, but light too intense for mortal eyes to bear, truth too complete for earthly understanding to grasp, beauty too perfect for temporal existence to contain. Death was not the enemy, but the graduation, not the end, but the beginning of education that would continue. as long as consciousness itself endured, which was to say, forever, the legacy that never dies. In the ruins of ancient theaters carved into Mediterranean hillsides, where marble seats still face stages that once echoed with the voices of heroes and gods, something extraordinary reveals itself to anyone who listens carefully. The stories told here 3,000 years ago continue to whisper through every modern narrative, every contemporary character, every psychological theory that attempts to explain the human condition. The ancient myths never died. They simply put on new costumes and learned to speak in new languages. The power of Greek mythology to endure and transform across millennia lies not in its antiquity, but in its revelation of patterns that govern consciousness itself. When the Greeks created stories of Zeus's struggle to balance justice, with desire of Achilles choosing glory over longevity of Pandora opening the jar that released both suffering and hope into the world, they were not merely entertaining themselves with fantastical tales. They were mapping the eternal architecture of human nature, the fundamental structures that make any story worth telling and any character worth caring about. Modern psychology discovered what ancient storytellers had always known: that human behavior follows patterns, so consistent they might as well be natural laws. Sigmund Freud, exploring the darkest recesses of the unconscious mind, found himself reaching again and again for mythological names to describe what he observed. The Oedipus complex, the most famous concept in all of psychoanalysis, acknowledged that the story of the king who unknowingly killed his father and married his mother revealed something so fundamental about human development that it could serve as the foundation for understanding how consciousness itself is formed. Freud understood that Oedipus was not just an ancient character, but an eternal pattern. The child who must symbolically kill the parent to become an adult, the consciousness that must destroy its origins to achieve independence, the individual who discovers that growth requires a form of violence against the very forces that created them. Every teenager who rebels against parental authority, every artist who rejects their teacher's influence, every revolutionary who overthrows the established order is living out the Oedipus myth. In modern dress, Carl Jung went even deeper, recognizing that the Greek gods were not obsolete deities, but eternal archetypes, patterns of meaning that emerged from the collective unconscious of humanity itself. Zeus became the archetype of the wise king, the part of every psyche that seeks to establish order and justice. Hera embodied the eternal feminine principle that demands fidelity and punishes betrayal. Apollo represented the drive toward light, consciousness, and rational understanding, while Dionysus expressed the equally necessary forces of chaos, ecstasy, and transcendence. Jung's insight was revolutionary. The gods were not external beings who occasionally intervened in human affairs, but internal realities that constantly shaped human behavior. Every person contained within their psyche a Zeus who sought to rule wisely, a Hera who demanded loyalty, an Aphrodite who pursued beauty and love, an Ares who was willing to fight for what mattered. The conflicts between these internal archetypes generated the dramas that defined individual personality and drove the stories that cultures told about themselves. The heroes of Greek mythology became templates for understanding the journey of consciousness, from innocence through trial to wisdom. Joseph Campbell, studying mythologies from around the world, discovered that the pattern followed by heroes like Perseus, Theseus, and Heracles appeared in every culture. The call to adventure, the crossing of thresholds, the confrontation with monsters, the return with wisdom or power that could benefit the community. This monomyth or hero's journey became the conscious foundation for countless modern stories. From Star Wars to Harry Potter, from The Lord of the Rings to Marvel superhero films, Luke Skywalker's journey from farm boy to Jedi Knight follows the exact pattern established by Perseus' transformation from imprisoned youth to monster-slaying hero. Both young men receive divine gifts. Perseus gets winged sandals and a reflecting shield. Luke gets a lightsaber and training in the Force. Both face impossible tasks that require them to transcend their normal human limitations. Both must confront father figures who embody the very evil they seek to destroy. Both discover that their greatest weapon is not physical strength, but moral clarity. The willingness to choose compassion over revenge even when vengeance seems justified. Harry Potter's story draws so heavily from mythological patterns that it reads like a modern retelling of classical themes. The orphaned hero raised by cruel relatives echoes countless mythological foundlings. The school that teaches magical arts resembles the hidden places, where heroes receive divine education. The prophecy that marks Harry as the one destined to defeat evil follows the pattern of oracular pronouncements that shaped the destinies of ancient heroes. The Horcruxes that contain pieces of Voldemort's soul represent the same principle embodied in monsters like the Hydra, evil that multiplies when attacked conventionally and can only be defeated through understanding its true nature. The Marvel and DC universes openly acknowledge their debt to classical mythology by featuring gods as characters, but their more profound connection lies in how they structure heroic identity itself. Superman's origin story, the last son of a dying world, sent to Earth by loving parents, raised by humble farmers, discovering powers that make him a bridge between human and divine, follows the pattern established by heroes like Heracles and Achilles, beings whose dual nature made them capable of impossible achievements, while remaining fundamentally vulnerable to loss and suffering. The X-Men comics explore themes that would have been immediately recognizable to ancient audiences. The relationship between power and responsibility, the tension between individual gifts, and social acceptance, the question of whether those blessed with superhuman abilities should rule over or serve those less fortunate. Professor Xavier and Magneto represent the same fundamental conflict, embodied in different mythological traditions. The wise mentor who seeks integration with the existing order versus the revolutionary who believes that power creates its own moral imperatives. Batman's psychology draws directly from the mythological understanding of how trauma can become transformation. Bruce Wayne's decision to become a vigilante after witnessing his parents' murder follows the pattern of heroes whose greatest wounds become their greatest strengths. His choice to embody fear in order to fight fear to become a creature of the night, in order to bring justice to darkness, reflects the mythological principle that the most effective warriors against any force must understand that force from within. The appeal of vampire and zombie narratives in contemporary culture reveals the enduring power of mythological themes about death and resurrection. the boundary between mortal and immortal existence, the price of transcending normal human limitations. The vampire represents the Tantalus principle, eternal life coupled with eternal hunger, power purchased through the permanent loss of simple human satisfaction. Zombie apocalypse stories explore the same fears that drove ancient tales of divine punishment. The possibility that civilization's achievements are fragile, that human nature contains destructive forces that can overwhelm all progress. Modern fantasy literature, from Tolkien through George R.R. Martin to contemporary urban fantasy, consciously employs mythological structures while exploring contemporary concerns. Tolkien's Middle-earth was deliberately constructed as a mythology for England, using patterns derived from Germanic and Celtic traditions, but addressing the 20th century experience of industrial warfare and environmental destruction. The ring of power that corrupts all who possess it represents the mythological understanding that some forms of power are inherently corrupting, that the desire to control existence inevitably destroys what makes existence valuable. Game of Thrones draws its political complexity from a mythological understanding that power corrupts not through external temptation, but through internal transformation. Those who seek power for good reasons find themselves changed by the pursuit, while those who refuse power often discover that their refusal enables greater evils. The series' treatment of prophecy, honor, and the relationship between individual desire and political necessity follows patterns established in Greek tragedy, particularly the understanding that the qualities that make heroes admirable often become the sources of their destruction. The persistence of mythological patterns in contemporary storytelling reveals something profound about human consciousness itself. We continue to face the same fundamental challenges that confronted our ancestors, and we continue to find meaning in the same kinds of solutions. The external circumstances change. Gods become superheroes, monsters become aliens, prophetic oracles become artificial intelligences. But the underlying patterns remain constant because they reflect the eternal structure of consciousness encountering itself and the world it inhabits. Psychotherapy has become, in many ways, the modern equivalent of mythological initiation. The therapist serves the role once played by the wise mentor who guided heroes through their trials, helping individuals understand that their personal struggles are variations on eternal themes, that their private pain participates in universal patterns of growth and transformation. The process of therapy follows the hero's journey, the recognition that change is necessary, the willingness to enter unknown territory, the confrontation with internal monsters, the integration of new understanding, the return to ordinary life with increased wisdom. The popularity of personality typing systems, from Myers-Briggs to the Enneagram, reflects the same impulse that once led people to identify with particular gods or mythological figures. These systems provide frameworks for understanding individual differences while acknowledging universal patterns, ways of seeing personal characteristics as variations on archetypal themes rather than unique quirks that isolate individuals from the larger human community. Contemporary discussions of trauma and resilience employ concepts that would have been immediately familiar to ancient audiences. Post-traumatic stress disorder represents what the Greeks understood as the price of heroic action. Exposure to experiences that fundamentally change consciousness, that cannot be forgotten or undone, that require integration rather than elimination. The modern understanding that trauma can become a source of strength through proper processing follows the mythological pattern of the wounded healer, the hero whose greatest power emerges from their deepest suffering. The environmental movement draws heavily on mythological themes about the relationship between human ambition and natural law. The story of Pandora's box, the woman who released suffering into the world through curiosity, but retained hope as the final gift, provides a template for understanding how human innovation creates unintended consequences while maintaining the possibility of redemption. Climate change narratives often follow the pattern of divine punishment stories, warning that violations of cosmic law, now called ecological balance, will result in catastrophes that can only be averted through fundamental changes in behavior and consciousness. The digital age has created new versions of ancient mythological concerns. Artificial intelligence development follows the Prometheus pattern, the theft of divine fire consciousness itself, to benefit humanity, with questions about whether the gods or the universe will permit such theft without exacting a terrible price. Social media platforms embody the same dynamics explored in stories about divine gossip and reputation, the power of narrative to shape reality, the danger of being seen and judged by invisible audiences. The way that attempts to control one's image often backfire spectacularly. Video games have become interactive mythologies, allowing players to experience heroic journeys firsthand rather than merely observing them. The structure of most games follows the classical pattern: the ordinary world disrupted by crisis, the call to adventure, the acquisition of allies, and magical tools, the series of increasingly difficult trials. The final confrontation with the source of evil, the restoration of order. Players literally live out the mythological understanding that growth requires challenge, that power must be earned through trial, that the greatest victories require the greatest risks. The enduring appeal of mythological stories lies not in their answers, but in their questions. They do not provide simple solutions to life's challenges, but rather illuminate the eternal nature of those challenges, the patterns that connect individual experience to universal truth. They teach us that our struggles are not unique but archetypal, that our suffering participates in cosmic processes of growth and transformation, that our choices matter not just for ourselves, but for the larger story of consciousness itself. The gods and heroes of ancient mythology continue to live because they represent possibilities that consciousness can achieve. Zeus's justice, Athena's wisdom, Aphrodite's love, Heracles' strength, Odysseus' cunning, Cassandra's prophetic insight. These are not external figures to be worshipped, but internal potentials to be developed. Not supernatural beings to petition, but aspects of our own nature to be understood and integrated. The tragedies that befell mythological characters continue to teach because they reveal the inevitable conflicts built into existence itself. The tension between individual desire and social responsibility, between the longing for transcendence and the necessity of limitation, between love that seeks to possess and love that learns to release. These conflicts have not been solved by 3,000 years of human progress, Because they are not problems to be solved, but tensions to be navigated, eternal aspects of what it means to be conscious beings in a complex universe. The modern world has produced new versions of ancient stories, because consciousness itself remains essentially unchanged. We still struggle with the same fundamental questions that occupied our ancestors. How should power be exercised? What does it mean to love wisely? How can individual fulfillment be balanced with community responsibility? What price is too high for achieving our deepest desires? How can we find meaning in the face of mortality and limitation? The myths endure because they provide not escape from these questions, but deeper engagement with them, not false comfort, but genuine guidance for navigating the eternal challenges of conscious existence. They remind us that we are part of a story larger than our individual lives, that our choices participate in patterns of meaning that connect us to all who have lived before and all who will live after, that the struggles we face in our ordinary lives are variations on themes that have occupied human consciousness since consciousness began to tell stories about itself. In the end, we still see ourselves in these 3,000-year-old characters because we are these characters, dressed in contemporary clothing, but driven by the same eternal forces, facing the same essential challenges, seeking the same fundamental truths. The gods and heroes of mythology are not ancient history, but eternal present. Not obsolete superstitions, but living realities that continue to shape every story we tell, every choice we make, every dream we pursue. Their legacy never dies because consciousness itself never dies. And consciousness will always need stories that help it understand its own nature, its own possibilities, and its own eternal quest for meaning in a universe that demands both courage and wisdom from all who dare to live consciously within it.